There is an empire that ancient Greek and Roman writers described in almost reverent terms, an empire with monumental cities, vast trade networks, iron furnaces that never went cold, and rulers so powerful that Rome itself had to negotiate rather than conquer. An empire that sat at the centre of the ancient world for over 1,000 years, and there is a decent chance nobody ever taught you its name. That's not an accident. That's a story in itself. Here's what makes this so strange. The ancient sources aren't vague about this place. Greek historians wrote about it. Roman generals fought its armies and then backed down. Egyptian records describe its kings as pharaohs of a foreign power that occasionally turned around and ruled Egypt itself. There are inscriptions carved in a script that took modern scholars over a century to partially decode. There are pyramids, more pyramids than Egypt, still standing in the desert of what is now Sudan. And yet somewhere between the ancient world and the modern classroom, this civilization got quietly set aside, reduced to a footnote, sometimes erased entirely. The empire was Kush. And before you assume you already know this story, I want to tell you that what we're going to go through together is not the cleaned-up, simplified version. Because Kush is not simple. It's not a single kingdom that rose and fell in a neat arc. It's more than 1,000 years of changing capitals, shifting power, military conquest, cultural fusion, and a civilization that developed its own writing system, its own gods, its own architectural style, and its own way of governing while the rest of the ancient world was still figuring things out. Why does this matter? Because the story we were handed about Africa and the ancient world has a shape to it, and that shape is missing something enormous. When people talk about the great powers of antiquity, they reach for Rome, Greece, Persia, Egypt. The conversation almost never crosses south of the first cataract of the Nile, and when it does, the kingdoms there tend to get described as peripheral, derivative, secondary to the civilizations further north. What the actual evidence suggests is something very different. What it suggests is a civilization that was sometimes a rival to Egypt, sometimes its conqueror, and later a power capable of going toe-to-toe with Rome on the frontier and walking away with a treaty. Now, I want to be upfront about something. This is a field where the archaeology is still unfolding, where translations are debated, and where there are genuine gaps in what we know. Some of what we'll go through is widely accepted among historians and archaeologists. Some of it is the current best interpretation of incomplete evidence. I'm going to tell you which is which, because getting excited about a lost civilization is one thing, but understanding it honestly is something more interesting. The mystery here isn't manufactured, it's real. And the real version is more compelling than anything that needs to be exaggerated. The evidence trail we're going to follow runs through Greek accounts written 2,000 years ago, through Roman military records, through Egyptian temple inscriptions, through decades of archaeological excavation at sites that most people outside the field have never heard of. We'll look at what those sources agree on, where they contradict each other, and what modern archaeology has added that the ancient writers couldn't have known or wouldn't have said. And here's the thing that keeps pulling me back to this story. Every time researchers dig deeper into Kushite history, the civilization gets bigger, not smaller. Every excavation season seems to turn up something that pushes the timeline further back, or extends the reach of the empire further than previously mapped. There are sites still buried under Sudanese desert sand that have barely been touched. The full picture isn't in yet. Before we go any further, I want to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Drop it in the comments. I actually read them. It's one of my favourite things watching this map of the world light up. Someone in Nairobi at midnight, someone in Toronto at lunch, someone in Cairo in the middle of the afternoon. Leave it there. Because the story we're about to go through is one that connects across all of that distance. And it starts a very long time ago in a landscape that most people today would not even recognise. So where do you actually find an empire that the modern world largely forgot? You start with the people who didn't forget. And the first thing you discover is that the ancient world knew Kush extremely well. The problem isn't absence of evidence. The problem is that the evidence comes filtered through other people's agendas, other people's languages and categories that don't quite map onto the reality they were trying to describe. Let's start with the Greeks, because they left the most. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, describes a place he calls Ethiopia, a land of tall, long-lived people, wealthy beyond measure, with gold so abundant they used it to chain their prisoners. He mentions a city called Meroe as a great city. He describes Ethiopian soldiers fighting in the armies of Persian kings. Now here's where you have to slow down and pay attention, because the word Ethiopia meant something completely different in the ancient world than it does today. The Greeks used it as a broad geographic label, roughly translating to land of the burnt-faced people, and they applied it to essentially everything south and southeast of Egypt. It wasn't a specific country, it was a direction on their mental map. So when Herodotus writes about Ethiopia, he's sometimes talking about Kush, sometimes talking about regions further south, sometimes conflating both with a layer of mythology on top. Brilliant observer, but working with second-hand information about a place he probably never visited. Strabo, writing roughly 4 centuries later under Rome, is more systematic. His geography dedicates real attention to the Nile corridor south of Egypt, describes Meroe as a significant urban centre, mentions the role of the ruling queens he calls Candace, and notes the military capacity of the people there. He's sceptical of Herodotus in places, which is useful, but he's also writing with Roman imperial priorities shaping what he emphasises and what he glosses over. Pliny the Elder adds more detail still, describing Meroe's location, the scale of its territory, the goods that move through its trade networks. By the time you get into Byzantine and early Arabic sources, you're picking up references to a Nile Valley civilization at various stages of its decline, kingdoms that inherited parts of the Kushite world and were still being reckoned with politically into the early centuries of the Common Era. Put all of that together and you get something. But what you get is a portrait drawn by outsiders, each with their own reasons for seeing what they saw, emphasizing what they emphasized, and leaving out what didn't fit their purposes. The Romans, for instance, were primarily interested in Kush as a military and trade problem. Egyptian sources were interested in Kush as a subordinate territory when they could control it, and a threatening power when they couldn't. Nobody was sitting down with the goal of giving posterity an accurate ethnography of a civilization they had no political interest in flattering. This is why the non-textual evidence matters so much, and there is a lot of it. The royal inscriptions are where you start hearing Kushite voices directly. At sites like Jebel Barkal, Napatan, and across the landscape of what is now northern Sudan, there are inscriptions left by Kushite rulers in their own names, describing their own military campaigns, their own building programs, their own religious devotion. Some of these are written in Egyptian hieroglyphics, which the Kushite elite adopted and used with impressive fluency. Others are in Meroitic, a script developed within Kush itself, adapted from Egyptian but representing a completely different language. The frustrating thing about Meroitic is that while we can read the phonetic values of the symbols, we still don't fully understand the underlying language. We can sound out the words, we just can't always tell you what they mean. That's not a small gap, that's an entire dimension of Kushite self-expression that remains partially locked to us. Then there are the temples, massive, still standing in some cases, built in a distinctly Kushite architectural tradition that borrowed from Egypt but developed its own proportions, its own iconography, its own relationship between the sacred and the political. There are the cemeteries, particularly the royal burial grounds at Meroe and El Kuru and Nuri, where the pyramid fields tell you immediately that you're dealing with rulers who had both the resources and the organizational capacity to move enormous amounts of stone. There are trade goods, Kushite iron and gold showing up in Mediterranean contexts, Mediterranean pottery and luxury items showing up in Sudanese excavation sites, a material record of connection that stretches from the sub-Saharan interior all the way to the Roman frontier. Now here's what the evidence can and can't tell us. The texts have bias baked in. The archaeology has preservation problems because the Sudanese climate and centuries of looting and simple neglect have taken their toll on sites that were never as systematically studied as their Egyptian equivalents. There are cemeteries that were ransacked by 19th century treasure hunters before any trained archaeologist could document them. There are royal inscriptions damaged beyond recovery. There are wooden objects and textiles and organic materials that simply didn't survive. What we have is extraordinary. What we've lost is irreplaceable. What this means for the story we're going to tell is that we have to hold it carefully. Some of what follows is solid consensus, supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. Some of it is the most reasonable current interpretation of fragmentary data, and those interpretations shift as new excavations happen. The timeline we're going to follow runs from roughly 2500 BCE, when the earliest recognizable Kushite political structures appear in the archaeological record, through the Great Kingdom of Kerma, through the Napatan phase when Kushite kings ruled Egypt as pharaohs, through the Meroitic period when the empire reached something close to its maximum reach and sophistication, and finally into the 3rd and 4th centuries CE when the structure begins to fracture. That's over 2,000 years. 2,000 years of a civilization that the modern world treats as a footnote. And the question that sits underneath all of it, the one we're going to keep returning to, is this. If the evidence is this substantial, if the ancient sources reference this empire repeatedly, if the monuments are literally still standing, then how does something this large become invisible? How do you erase an empire? That's where we're going. But first, you need to understand the land itself. Because before you can understand why Kush became what it became, you have to understand what the land was offering. And what the land was offering was extraordinary. Start with the Nile. Not the Nile as a pretty geographic feature, but the Nile as a machine. A system for turning an otherwise impossible environment into one of the most productive agricultural zones on Earth. The river doesn't just flow through northeastern Africa, it organizes it. Everything about how people move, communicate, trade, and fight in this region for thousands of years is shaped by the corridor the Nile cuts through the desert. You either control the river, or you're at the mercy of whoever does. In the stretch that would become the heartland of Kush, roughly the territory of what is now northern and central Sudan, the Nile isn't a simple highway. It's interrupted by cataracts, places where granite outcroppings force the water through narrow churning channels that are essentially impassable for large boats. The ancient Egyptians knew about these. The first cataract was their traditional southern frontier. Below that, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th cataracts created a series of natural barriers and choke points all the way into the deep interior of the continent. This matters enormously for political history. Whoever sat at one of those cataracts controlled what could pass. Trade, armies, communication, everything funneled through these narrow points. You don't need a vast army to hold a cataract. You need a fortified position and the organizational willpower to maintain it. This is geography doing political work. Between the cataracts, the Nile periodically widens into fertile reaches. The annual flood deposited silt onto the riverbanks, and those banks supported agriculture dense enough to feed populations that could then support specialists, artisans, soldiers, administrators, priests. All the ingredients of complex society laid down every year by water moving off the East African highlands. The cycle was predictable enough to plan around, which meant surplus, which meant storage, which meant power concentrated in whoever controlled the surplus. The same mechanism that built Egypt built Kush. The river was the engine, and anyone who understood how to use it had a structural advantage over everyone who didn't. But the Nile corridor was only part of the story. Nubia was sitting on resources that made outsiders pay attention for thousands of years before any empire formed. Gold first. The eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea coast is geologically ancient and minerally rich, and the gold deposits there were among the most significant in the ancient world. Not traces. Substantial, exploitable deposits that could produce enough metal to make rulers wealthy, to fund monumental building programs, to purchase political alliances, to attract traders from thousands of miles away. When ancient sources describe the wealth of the people south of Egypt, they're not using poetic license. They're describing a real material fact. The gold was there. Stone, too. The Nubian landscape offers granite, sandstone, and other building materials that lend themselves to monumental construction. You don't build pyramids and temples at the scale the Kushites eventually did without access to stone and the knowledge of how to work it systematically. The quarrying traditions in this region have roots going back to the earliest phases of settlement, long before any identifiable state exists. Then there was cattle wealth. The savanna and semi-arid grassland supporting the river corridor could sustain substantial herds, and in ancient African societies cattle were not just food. They were currency, social currency, the measure of a family's standing, the medium through which marriages were negotiated and alliances sealed. Societies organized around cattle wealth developed particular kinds of social hierarchy. particular kinds of obligation and reciprocity that can be channeled into state structures when conditions are right. And this is where ecology starts doing political work in a different way. The desert edges hemming in the Nile corridor weren't just barriers, they were filters. The people who could survive along the Nile were the people who had mastered a specific demanding environment. The desert created compression. It pushed populations toward the river, and compressed populations along a linear resource like the Nile will, over time, develop mechanisms for managing competition and cooperation, which is another way of saying they develop politics. What archaeology tells us is that this region had a long, complex human history well before anything we'd recognize as a state. Settlement in the Nubian Nile Valley goes back tens of thousands of years. By the Neolithic period, the population along the Middle Nile was already developing regional identities, distinct material cultures, burial traditions that show real continuity across generations. These weren't wandering bands. These were communities with territorial roots, with social memory, with the accumulated knowledge of people who had lived in one place long enough to understand it deeply. When archaeologists excavate Neolithic cemeteries in this region, they find evidence of status differentiation, of individuals buried with more goods than others, of communities organized in ways that anticipate the hierarchies that will eventually produce kingdoms. The empire didn't arrive from nowhere. It grew from something already there. What Nubia also offered, and this is crucial, was position. The territory sat at a crossroads. To the north, Egypt, and through it, the Mediterranean world. To the east, the Red Sea coast and the trade routes connecting to Arabia, India, and East Africa. To the south and west, the deep African interior, with its own networks of people, goods, and ideas. Whoever held the Nile corridor south of Egypt wasn't just controlling a strip of agricultural land. They were controlling one of the most significant trade corridors on the planet. Ivory, ebony, incense, animal skins, enslaved people, exotic goods of every description moved through this territory. The people who organized and taxed that movement accumulated power accordingly. What archaeology can't yet tell us with confidence is exactly how the transition happened, how these deep-rooted communities of the Middle Nile Valley moved from complex chieftaincies to something we'd recognize as a territorial state. The evidence suggests it was gradual, competitive, and probably violent in places. But the conditions for it were present for a very long time before the First Kingdom crystallized, and when it did, it had a remarkable foundation to build on. When those conditions finally did crystallize, the first real political heavyweight on the Middle Nile announces itself in the archaeological record with a single name, Kerma. Kerma was not a footnote to Egypt. It was not a border outpost. It was an early urban kingdom in its own right, centered around a city that rises out of the desert like a statement. And the statement is, we are here, we are organized, and we are powerful. You can see that in the architecture first. At the heart of Kerma stands a massive mud brick structure archaeologists call the Western Defufa. It's not a copy of anything Egyptian. It's its own thing. Huge, thick walls, multiple levels, internal chambers, staircases, courtyards. Some researchers think it functioned as a temple. Others see it as a complex ceremonial and administrative center. Either way, it tells you this society could mobilize thousands of laborers, engineers, and craftsmen for a long-term building project. You don't get that without a central authority that can command resources and coordinate people at scale. Around it, you have a real city, not a scattering of huts, but dense settlements spreading along the Nile bank. Houses, workshops, storage facilities, areas that look like industrial zones. You find specialized production everywhere. Pottery that's so fine and thin, the best examples are almost eggshell, beautifully burnished in deep black and red. Carefully worked stone tools and later metal objects, evidence of leatherworking, bead-making, and probably textile production. The people of Kerma weren't just living along the Nile. They were crafting an urban economy around it. And then there are the dead. South of the main town lies a burial field that by itself should have been enough to put Kerma into every history textbook. Massive tumulus graves, huge earth mounds surrounded by rings of smaller burials. At the centre of these mounds, elite individuals laid out with rich grave goods, jewellery, imported objects, finely made ceramics, sometimes entire rooms full of offerings. Some of the largest mounds are bigger than many Egyptian royal tombs from the same period. Early excavators thought they were looking at Egyptian colonial officials buried on foreign soil. But as the evidence accumulated, that idea collapsed. The architecture, the burial customs, the objects, the biological remains, they all point clearly to a Nubian elite, burying their own rulers according to their own traditions. This is Kerma's royal cemetery. This is a dynasty, or several dynasties, putting their power into the ground in a way nobody could miss. Those burials also hint at something darker, the presence of human sacrifice, or at least retainer burial. Around the central figures we find the remains of dozens, sometimes hundreds of individuals, likely attendants, guards, and household members, buried alongside their ruler. People whose social role was tied so closely to the king or queen in life that their death was bound to his or her passing. That kind of practice doesn't emerge from a loose federation of equals. It comes from a steeply hierarchical society where the ruler stands at a very different level of value and obligation than everyone else. So when we talk about Kerma as the first great Nubian kingdom, this isn't exaggeration. The fortifications around the city, the monumental architecture, the elite burials, the craft specialization, they all converge on the same point. This is a state. Someone is organizing labor. Someone is collecting and redistributing resources. Someone is making decisions for a large number of people and has the means to enforce them. And Kerma didn't exist in a vacuum. It sat just upriver from one of the other great river civilizations of the ancient world, Egypt. That proximity shaped almost everything about its history. For a long time, older scholarship cast Kerma as essentially a side character in an Egyptian story, a source of gold, cattle, and captives, sometimes a rebellious province, sometimes a trade partner, always defined by what Egypt was doing. But when you flip the perspective and put Kerma at the centre, a different picture appears. From Kerma's vantage point, Egypt was the northern neighbour, sometimes useful, often dangerous, always worth watching. The relationship between them oscillated between trade and war, dependence and dominance, over centuries. At its simplest level, there was exchange. Kerma controlled access to the goldfields and to African products that Egyptians craved: ivory, ebony, exotic animal skins, incense, resin, people. Egyptian artifacts show up at Kerma sites: scarabs, beads, luxury items, while Nubian ceramics and goods make their way north. Caravans and riverboats moved up and down the Nile corridor, and both sides taxed that movement. But trade never happens in a political vacuum. Whoever controlled Kerma controlled a major choke point on the river and the main gateway to the resources further south. That meant leverage. And Kerma's leverage increased dramatically during one of Egypt's weakest phases, the Second Intermediate Period, roughly the 17th to 16th centuries BCE. While Egypt was fractured, Theban kings in the south, Hyksos rulers in the north, local elites in between, the kingdom of Kerma seems to have been cohesive, expanding, and aggressive. Archaeology and Egyptian texts together suggest that Kerma pushed north during this time, turning the frontier tables, fortified sites further downriver, Nubian-style artifacts deep inside what had been Egyptian territory, and Egyptian records complaining about Nubian incursions all tell the same story. Kerma didn't just sit back and watch Egypt crumble. It intervened. Some scholars even argue that Kerma allied with the Hyksos in the north against the Theban dynasty in the south, trying to squeeze Egypt from both ends. Others see the relationship as more opportunistic than formally diplomatic. Either way, Kerma's rulers understood the geopolitics of the Nile. When the big neighbour was divided, they used that division to press their own advantage. This is where you really see the outlines of a state-level apparatus at Kerma. You don't conduct long-distance war and sophisticated diplomacy from a loose coalition of tribal chiefs. You need planning. You need logistics. You need fortified outposts and the administration to supply them. The major Kerma sites show substantial defensive works, thick walls, bastions, planned gateways, suggesting a leadership that expected conflict and organised for it. Inside those walls, there are hints of a bureaucratic core. Standardised storage jars, ceilings used to control access to goods, evidence of large-scale grain storage and redistribution. Workshops clustered in ways that point to centralised management rather than purely household production. This is the kind of pattern you see in early states across the world, the coalescence of power around a fortified, administratively complex urban centre that can project authority along a river valley. At the same time, everything about the material culture screams that this was not Egypt, but slightly different. The pottery styles, the layout of the city, the burial customs, the religious architecture, the iconography, they follow their own internal logic. Kerma elites clearly knew what was happening in Egypt. They acquired Egyptian goods, they understood Egyptian prestige, but they chose to invest in their own symbols of power. Where Egyptians covered their royal dead in stone-cut pyramids with decorated chapels, Kerma's rulers preferred enormous earth mounds with rings of human and animal burials. Where Egyptian temples laid out long axial plans, Kerma's dafufas rose as compact towering blocks. Where Egyptian art emphasizes certain gods and royal imagery, Kerma's symbolic world, as far as we can glimpse it, is distinct. You're looking at a civilization that is in conversation with Egypt, not copying it. Even basic questions like language remain open. We don't have texts from Kerma itself that we can read, so we don't know what its people called their kingdom, their rulers, or their gods. Egyptian sources lump many southern peoples under broad labels. That means our terminology is blunt and external. Kerma, as we use the word, is an archaeological culture and an urban centre, not the self-name of a people. And that uncertainty matters when we try to reconstruct how they saw themselves. There's a lot we still don't know, and scholars argue about it. How far did Kerma's authority actually reach? Some think its influence ran from at least the Second Cataract deep into central Sudan, maybe beyond, creating a territorial state hundreds of kilometres long. Others see a core region around the city, and a looser ring of allied or subordinate communities tied together by trade, marriage, and occasional coercion. Population estimates are similarly debated. The size of the cemeteries and the density of remains suggest a substantial population, but how many thousands of people lived in and around Kerma at its peak is, at best, an informed guess. And the exact shape of the political structure? Was this a centralised monarchy with a clear succession system? A coalition of powerful lineages dominated by one dynasty? Remains partly hidden in the dust. What isn't in doubt is that by the late Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period, Kerma was strong enough to contest Egypt for control of the Nile, strong enough that when Egypt finally reunified under powerful Theban kings and turned south again in the early New Kingdom, they didn't see a passive borderland. They saw a rival that had once pushed them back and could conceivably do it again. The response was brutal and decisive. Over the course of the 16th century BCE, Egypt's pharaohs launched campaigns that smashed Kerma's power, burned its city, and folded Nubia into an imperial system that would last for centuries. On the surface, this looks like the end of the first Nubian kingdom, but conquest doesn't erase memory overnight. The people who had built Kerma, who had known Nubian kings buried under those great tumuli, who had lived under a government that looked south for its identity and north for its opportunities, they didn't disappear. Their experience of autonomy, of centralised rule based in Nubia itself, persisted in stories, in habits, in local elites who now served foreign masters. And that long memory matters, because centuries later, when Egypt's own power fractured again, those traditions and that sense of what a Nubian kingdom could be would re-emerge on the stage under a new name, Napata. Egypt's new kingdom didn't just conquer Nubia, it rewired it. After Kerma's fall, Egyptian armies pushed deep into the south, well beyond the old frontier. They took over forts, built new ones, and turned the Nile corridor into something Egypt had never really had before, a proper overseas province. Administrators arrived with them, viceroys of Kush, royal officials with titles like King's Son of Kush, ruled in the name of the pharaoh. They collected taxes in grain, cattle, and gold. They supervised mines and quarries. They organized labor for state projects. On papyrus and temple walls, Nubia appears as a place to be managed and exploited, its wealth flowing north toward Thebes and Memphis. Temples followed the soldiers and scribes. Egyptian gods, especially Amun, were planted in Nubian soil. At sites like Soleb and Amara, pharaohs built sandstone sanctuaries with pylons, courtyards, hyper-style halls, all the architectural grammar of Egypt, now translated upriver. Statues in the Egyptian style, carved with hieroglyphs praising the king, looked out over communities that had once answered to Kerma. Local elites were folded into this system. Some Nubian notables were educated in Egyptian ways, learned to write hieroglyphs, adopted Egyptian dress and names. They appear in inscriptions as loyal officials, priests, commanders, trusted enough to administer on behalf of the pharaoh. Others were removed or marginalized. Over generations, a new provincial aristocracy emerged, one that understood both worlds, but officially lived in the shadow of Egypt. This changed everything: land tenure, ritual calendars, legal procedures, even how power announced itself in stone. For centuries, if you wanted to be someone in Nubia, you did it through Egypt, its temples, its bureaucracy, its royal favours. But empires don't last forever. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, Egypt's new kingdom was fraying. External pressures from the Sea Peoples and Libyan groups in the north, internal struggles over succession and resources, and the sheer cost of maintaining far-flung garrisons all took their toll. Pharaohs still carved triumphant scenes on walls, but the state behind those scenes was hollowing out. On the Nubian frontier, the change is visible in negative space. Forts aren't maintained with the same care. Monumental building slows. Administrative documents thin out, then vanish. Step by step, Egypt's grip on the south loosened. And when the imperial hand pulled back, it didn't retreat into a vacuum. It retreated from a landscape that had been reorganized, reimagined and saturated with new symbols. A landscape that included one particularly important place, a rocky outcrop near the fourth cataract that Egyptians called the Pure Mountain, and modern scholars know as Jebel Bakal. At the foot of that mountain, a new capital rose, Napata. We don't have a founding inscription that says, on this date the kingdom of Kush was reborn here. What we have are layers of clues, a cluster of temples, many dedicated to Amun, royal burials appearing nearby, inscriptions that start speaking not of Egypt's southern province, but of rulers whose primary identity is anchored in this Nubian centre. Why here? Part of the answer is geography. Napata sits near a major bend in the Nile, a natural choke point on river traffic, and a bridge between Egypt to the north and the savanna routes leading deep into Africa to the south and west. Control Napata, and you tap into trade, cattle pastoralism, and the flow of gold and other resources. But there's also sacred geography. Jebel Barkal isn't just a hill. It has a distinctive pinnacle that rises like a natural obelisk, visible from miles away. Egyptians had already mapped meaning onto it, claiming it as a dwelling place of Amun, and treating it as an extension of their own religious landscape. They built a temple at its base. In their ideology, this was the southern throne of their chief god. When Egyptian imperial power ebbed, that religious investment stayed. The mountain didn't stop being holy just because the garrison left. Local priests, local communities, local elites had lived inside that sacred map for generations. They understood perfectly well the prestige that radiated from an Amun temple, anchored to a pure mountain on the edge of the desert. Napata's emerging rulers leaned into that with both hands. They expanded the temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal, added chapels, reused and reinscribed blocks, erected their own statues. They commissioned new sanctuaries at other sites along the river. They presented themselves as pious benefactors of Amun, offering him gifts, building his houses, restoring his cult. In doing so, they weren't just showing off personal devotion, they were claiming custody of a god whose authority had once underwritten Egyptian kingship itself. This is how you turn religion into politics. If Amun is the god who chooses and legitimizes kings, and if Amun's most powerful southern seat is at your capital, then your throne is no longer provincial, it's central. We see this in the titles the early Napatan rulers begin to use. The picture is fuzzy. There are gaps in the sequence, inscriptions are damaged or missing, and scholars argue about exactly who followed whom. But certain trends stand out. Kings start calling themselves not only King of Kush, but also using full Egyptian royal titulary, Horus names, throne names, epithets that tie them to Ma'at, to Amun, to the cosmic order that Egyptian pharaohs had claimed for centuries. They appear in reliefs offering to gods in exactly the same poses as New Kingdom rulers. Their monuments use familiar formulas, beloved of Amun, enduring like Ra, chosen of the gods. On the surface, it looks like imitation. But context matters. These aren't Egyptian administrators parroting their master's language. These are Nubian rulers with their own power base, taking the symbolic tools of kingship that had dominated the region and retooling them for a re-centered state. Their alliances reflect the same hybrid logic. The Napatan kingdom seems to have started as a regional power around the Fourth Cataract, but its influence spread up and down the Nile through marriage ties, religious patronage, and perhaps military pressure. Temples they built or restored become nodal points in a network. Places where local elites could gather, swear oaths, share rituals, and recognize a broader authority. Culturally, Napata is where you really see the blending strategy sharpen into a weapon. Royal statues from this period often follow Egyptian conventions of pose and dress, kilt, Nimi's headdress, the whole visual package, but the faces can be distinctly Nubian in their features. Temple art replicates Egyptian mythic scenes, yet the people commissioning and overseeing these works are locals, and their burials nearby include elements that look back to older Nubian practices. Even royal burial architecture shows this duality. Pyramids reappear in Nubia, clearly evoking Egyptian royal tombs, but they're smaller, steeper, adapted to local tastes and traditions. Around them, grave goods and practices sometimes echo Kerma and other indigenous customs. It's not a one-way cultural takeover, it's selective adoption. This wasn't accidental. In a region that had lived under Egyptian rule for generations, Egyptian forms carried immense prestige. To reject them completely would have been to cut yourself off from a powerful language of legitimacy. To absorb them without modification would have been to become a pale copy of a fading empire. Napata's rulers chose a third path: speak Pharaoh, think Kush. Exactly how quickly this transformation happened is still debated. Did a single strong leader at Napata pull the strands together? Did a line of local chiefs gradually accumulate more religious and political authority until, at some point, they looked around and realized they were kings? The archaeological record doesn't answer cleanly. Names like Alar and Kashta appear, but their precise order, their relationships, and the exact extent of their power during their lifetimes are contested. What's clear is the direction of travel. Over a span of perhaps a few generations, a former imperial backwater turned into a self-conscious royal centre. Amun's cult at Jebel Barkal shifted from an extension of Thebes to a core of Nubian kingship. Titles that had once belonged to foreign overlords were now worn by men whose primary loyalty and base of support lay in Nubia itself. And as Napata's confidence grew, its gaze turned north. Egypt was in one of its fragmented phases again, ruled not by a single strong dynasty but by competing houses, regional power brokers and priests. The ideological tools of pharaonic rule were still there: temples, rituals, royal titles, but the state that had created them was weak. To the kings at Napata, watching from their pure mountain with a moon at their back and a revitalized Nubian kingdom at their feet, this looked less like a distant neighbour's misfortune and more like an opening. The age of occupation was over. The age of Kushite pharaohs was about to begin. When the chance finally came, It started with a man we still meet mostly through his own propaganda, Beyer. He wasn't an Egyptian governor or a northern warlord. He was a king of Kush, based at Napatan, anchored to Jebel Barkal and the cult of Amun. By the time he looked north, Egyptian unity was a memory. The country was carved up between local dynasts in the delta, powerful families in Middle Egypt, and an ambitious house based at Hermopolis. Theoretically, everyone still believed in the two lands under one pharaoh. Practically, the throne was empty. Beyer decided to fill it. We know this because he left behind one of the most remarkable inscriptions from the entire ancient Nile world, his Great Victory Stela. It reads like a political manifesto wrapped in a campaign diary. On the surface, it's a war story. Cities besieged, rivals humiliated, tribute pouring in. But listen to how he frames it. Beyer doesn't say, "I'm a foreign conqueror invading Egypt." He says, in effect, "I am the only real pharaoh left, and I'm coming north to clean up the mess." He presents his campaign as a religious duty. Amun, the same god whose temple stood at Thebes and at Jebel Barkal, has chosen him. The other kings, in his telling, have offended the gods, neglected temples, allowed chaos, Isfet, to spread. Their sacrifices are sloppy, their piety is fake, their rule is illegitimate. So Beyer marches north as the instrument of restoration, the one who will bring back Ma'at, the cosmic order. This is the key to understanding why a Kushite king didn't just raid Egypt and go home, but claim the double crown. Motives stack on top of each other. There's security. As long as Egypt is divided and unstable, threats can spill south, trade can be disrupted, temple networks can fracture. Controlling Egypt is a way of controlling your northern horizon. There's prestige. In a world where Egyptian ideas about kingship have been the gold standard for centuries, wearing the uraeus and being recognized as pharaoh catapults your standing across the region. There's religion. If you genuinely believe Amun chooses kings, and your dynasty controls one of Amun's most powerful cult centers, then stepping into the vacuum in Egypt isn't just opportune, it's almost a theological obligation. And there's timing. Beyer moves when the balance of power favors a southern intervention. No single northern ruler can shut him out. Some even appeal to him for help against their rivals. To an outsider, Egypt looks dangerous. To a Kushite king with an army, a strong religious brand, and a functioning state behind him, it looks ripe. The way Beyer tells the story, he advances deliberately. He doesn't rush straight for Memphis. He pauses to make offerings, to consult oracles, to perform purification rituals. He insists that his troops keep strict standards. No eating fish. No defiling themselves in ways Egyptian tradition considers impure. He shapes the entire campaign as a performance of pharaonic piety. When northern rulers submit, he doesn't necessarily depose all of them. He demands their surrender, their oaths, their daughters, their recognition of his superiority. They kiss the ground before him, they swear loyalty, forever. In other words, he turns a patchwork of petty kings into a hierarchy with himself at the top. Is every detail on the stela trustworthy? Probably not. Royal inscriptions compress, exaggerate, and polish. But the broad message is clear. From Napata's perspective, this wasn't a foreign invasion of Egypt. It was Egypt being reattached to a centre of power that now lay further south. This creates what we call the 25th dynasty, the so-called Kushite or Nubian dynasty of Egypt. For roughly a century, kings from Napata not only dominate Nubia but sit on Egypt's throne, ruling from Memphis and Thebes while still rooted in their southern heartland. You see their ambition etched into stone. Beyer and his successors, Shabitku, Shabaka, Tahaka, Tantamani, launch building programs that rival earlier high periods of Egyptian history. They restore decaying temples, commission new shrines, carve colossal statues. At Thebes, Tahaka puts his stamp on the sprawling temple of Karnak, adding massive columns and gateways. At Jebel Barkal, Napata's Amun temple grows into a major pilgrimage site, its sanctuaries inscribed with scenes that show Kushite kings receiving life and legitimacy directly from the gods. These are not the projects of provincial upstarts. They're the projects of rulers who think in imperial terms. They issue decrees, manage a complex bureaucracy, send officials to supervise far-flung estates. They integrate Egyptian scribal culture with their own power structures, using hieroglyphs and traditional formulas while anchoring loyalty in Nubian networks of kin and patronage. They marry strategically, both within their clan and into Egyptian elites, knitting together a composite political class that spans from the Delta to beyond the Fourth Cataract. Outside observers took notice. In the wider Near Eastern world, this Kushite-led Egypt isn't a side note, it's a major player. Assyrian kings, writing from Nineveh and Kalhu, don't talk about some Nubian tribe. They refer to the king of Egypt and Kush as a serious opponent. Diplomatic letters and war annals place this combined power alongside Assyria, Babylon, and later the rising Medes as one of the big beasts on the board. That's important. It means that from the perspective of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Kush isn't an obscure frontier. It's the southern backbone of an Egyptian empire that can project force into the Levant, meddle in Palestinian and Judean politics, and sponsor coalitions against Assyrian expansion. Taharqa, in particular, strides through both biblical and Assyrian sources as a key figure. In the Hebrew Bible, a Taharqa king of Kush appears as a potential saviour marching against the Assyrians. In Assyrian records, he's the adversary whose armies clash with Sennacherib and Esarhaddon. Archaeologically, he's the king whose monuments are scattered from Karwa in Nubia to the great temples of Upper Egypt. His reign shows both the apex and the vulnerability of Kushite rule in Egypt. The apex because under Taharqa the dynasty's building projects, religious prestige and international profile all peak. The vulnerability because this is when they run headfirst into the hard walls of Assyrian power. Assyria in this period is not a state you casually antagonize. Its army is professional, road networks are tight, siege technology is advanced, and its kings have no interest in a strong unified Egypt blocking their route to the Mediterranean. From their point of view, a powerful Kushite-backed pharaoh in Memphis is a problem to be solved. The solution plays out in stages. Assyrian armies push into the Levant, crush local revolts supported by Egypt, then turn their attention to the Nile. Campaigns drive down into Lower and then Upper Egypt. Cities are taken, garrisons installed, loot carted off. Taharqa is forced to retreat, then returns, then retreats again. Eventually, Assyrian pressure becomes relentless enough that the Kushite kings can't hold the north. By the time of Taharqa's successor Tantameni, the writing is on the wall. There's a last flicker of hope, a brief reconquest of parts of Egypt, a final attempt to reclaim Memphis and Thebes, but Assyrian power, combined with the rise of a more compliant local dynasty in the Delta, undercuts it. The Kushite royal presence in Egypt is squeezed out. Assyrian scribes, ever eager to frame victory as total, write as if they've decisively crushed the Nubian threat. From their point of view, they have. Pharaohs from Napatan no longer rule in Memphis. The 25th dynasty is over, but this is where narratives can mislead. Kushite rule in Egypt ends, yes. Kush itself does not. The kings don't vanish into thin air. They fall back on the power base that made the whole experiment possible in the first place. Napata, Jebel Barkal, the networks of temples and elites, and trade that runs south into the African interior. They continue to bury their dead in pyramids along the Nubian Nile. They continue to sponsor Amun's cult. They continue to think and act as kings. Losing Egypt is a major strategic and symbolic blow. It cuts off access to certain resources, to the prestige of ruling the two lands, to influence in the Mediterranean world. But it also forces a kind of recalibration. Without Memphis and the Delta, the centre of gravity slides decisively back upriver. In the long story of Kush, the 25th dynasty is not the endpoint. It's a hinge. For a brief spectacular century, Napata's kings step onto the Egyptian stage and remind the world that power on the Nile no longer flows only from the north. Then Assyria's moment passes through, redraws the map, and moves on. What's left behind in Nubia is not a shattered remnant, but a seasoned kingdom with imperial experience ready to reorient itself toward different frontiers. South of the old border, another chapter begins, one in which Egypt is no longer the main reference point, and a city called Meroitic starts to eclipse Napata as the beating heart of a still-living empire. So what does it even mean to say that this African kingdom rivaled Rome? It doesn't mean that Kush had a 1,000,000-man army, or paved highways from Scotland to Syria, or dictated policy to the entire Mediterranean. That's the cartoon version of rivalry that modern empires like to project backwards. If we're being honest with the evidence, rivaled Rome has to mean something more precise. Regionally, Kush was the heavyweight. For a very long stretch of time, if you lived anywhere along the Middle Nile in the surrounding deserts, or deep into some of the trade routes that fed the Red Sea, the power you had to negotiate with wasn't Rome, or Greece, or even Egypt. It was Kush. In wealth, it could match most of what any ancient Mediterranean state could draw from a comparable stretch of river and hinterland. Gold mines, iron production, agricultural surplus, cattle, ivory, incense, exotic woods, slaves. The whole menu of ancient high-value goods moved through Kushite hands. Strategically, it sat at a crossroads. Control of Kush meant control of the only reliable north-south corridor through northeastern Africa, plus access points to the Red Sea and into the Sahel. It could squeeze or nurture traffic between the Mediterranean, Inner Africa and Arabia. And maybe most importantly in resilience, it was a monster. Rome lasted, depending on how you count, a few centuries as a unified imperial state. Kush, in one political form or another, Kerma, Napata, Meroitic, stayed relevant for over 1,000 years. It survived Egyptian conquest, Assyrian shockwaves, Persian intrigues, Greek mercenaries, and Roman expansion. That ability to take hits, adapt, and keep going is its own kind of imperial greatness. If we want to understand how a river kingdom south of Egypt could do all that, we have to look at something that doesn't make good headlines, but makes empires live or die: state capacity. Kush didn't run itself on charisma and pyramid aesthetics. It ran on systems. Start with taxation and storage. Along the Nile, where the flood created narrow bands of arable land, Kushite kings and their officials oversaw estates, village fields, orchards, and cattle herds. Payments in grain, livestock and labour flowed toward royal centres, Napata first, later Meroitic. You don't build and maintain strings of pyramids, massive temples and long-distance armies without a reliable way of skimming surplus off your population. We see this in the archaeology. Big state granaries in temple complexes, storage pits in royal towns, administrative quarters where scribes and stewards would have counted, tallied and redistributed goods. We see it in texts from Egypt that mention Nubian officials, and in later Meroitic inscriptions that cluster around officials with titles attached to land, temples and the crown. Then there's labour, hauling multi-ton stone blocks, quarrying sandstone, digging desert wells, marching caravans across hundreds of kilometres of scrubland. None of that happens with a couple of volunteers and a weekend free. It takes the kind of mobilisation where the king can say, in effect, next month this many men from these communities are coming here to work on this project with food and tools supplied. Egypt had corvée labour, Rome had forced levies and provincial obligations. Kush, to play in that league, had to have its own ways of conscripting work and making it pay off. You see the results on the landscape. From Napata downriver, and then clustered even more densely around Meroitic, you get palace complexes, pyramid fields, and long lines of temples. These aren't scattered shrines put up by wandering chiefs. They're parts of a coordinated architectural program. Columns, pylons, processional ways. The same grammar of monumentality you see in Egypt and, in a different idiom, in Rome's forums and basilicas. Behind that stone is a bureaucracy. Scribes, inspectors, priests, overseers of fields and quarries, knitting together river villages, desert oases and outlying chiefdoms into one fiscal and ritual machine. But Kush's reach didn't stop at the Nile's banks. To the west and east, less visible from satellite images and coffee table books, were the routes that made Kush rich. To the west, caravan trails running out into the desert, linking the Nile Valley to oases, and then further on into the Sahel and Central Africa. Through those channels moved gold from distant mines, cattle from savanna pastures, ivory and animal skins, maybe even captives taken in wars far from the river. Kushite forts and stations along these routes acted like toll booths and safe houses, places where caravans could water, pay taxes and pick up official protection. To the east, paths that crossed the rocky plateau toward the Red Sea. The farther north you go, the more Egyptian and later Ptolemaic these lines become. Further south, Kushite influence deepens. Control of these corridors meant leverage over incense from Arabia, spices and aromatics from the Indian Ocean trade, and any maritime contact points emerging along the African coast. Then there were the inner African links. Kush wasn't just a derivative appendage of the Mediterranean, it was plugged into African worlds that Rome hardly even knew existed. South along the Nile, upside valleys, down seasonal rivers and overland tracks, royal and aristocratic networks tied together cattle-keeping communities, iron-working villages and forest-edge societies. Tribute, trade and marriage alliances brought in goods and people. Ideas moved too. Religious practices, artistic styles, political habits. When Roman geographers talk vaguely about Ethiopia and lands beyond, or when Greek merchants tell second-hand stories of gold and strange animals further up the Nile, they're glimpsing a traffic system in which Kush is the broker. Empires live and die by the sword as well as the ledger, and Kush knew that. Its military power wasn't just about marching armies north to Egypt. It was about managing frontiers. Along the Nile, forts guarded key choke points, bends in the river, narrow passes, cataracts where boats had to be unloaded and portaged. Garrison towns housed archers, spearmen and patrol units. Kushite archers, in particular, had a fearsome reputation all the way back into Egyptian records. Later, when the Romans show up, they learn the hard way that Nubian arrows are not something you shrug off. Out in the desert, smaller outposts and watchpoints extended royal eyes and ears beyond the green strip of the floodplain. Patrol routes linked wells and way stations. Control of water in the desert is control of movement. If you can deny an enemy access to a chain of wells, or guarantee safe passage for your own allies and caravans, you're effectively drawing invisible walls and corridors across the map. On top of that, Kush built security through relationships. Instead of trying to occupy every hill and wadi directly, it leaned on alliances and vassalage with local leaders, desert chiefs, oasis clans, southern headmen. Give them gifts, prestige, marriage ties, maybe the right to participate in certain rituals, and in return they funnel resources your way and warn you when trouble is coming. It's cheaper than permanent conquest, and in a landscape this big and thinly peopled, often more effective. All of this, the taxes, the granaries, the forts, the patrols, rested on something more intangible but just as powerful: prestige. Kushite kings didn't only claim authority because they had armies. They claimed it because they controlled the right rituals, the right temples, the right symbols. At Napatan and later Meroitic, royal power was staged in stone and ceremony. Temples to Amun and other gods formed the spiritual backbone of the state. Festivals, processions, oracles, these events told people year after year who was legitimate. The king didn't just attend, he embodied them. Royal iconography did serious work here. On temple walls and stelae, Kushite rulers appear smiting enemies, receiving life from gods, embracing divine consorts. They borrow Egyptian visual language, crowns, poses, hieroglyphic captions, but tweak it, mixing in Nubian features, local regalia, and scenes that emphasize their own sacred mountains and river stretches. Over time, especially in the Meroitic period, a distinct style emerges, different proportions, different artistic conventions, inscriptions in a script that reflects local languages. Controlling ritual meant controlling history. If you can decide which ancestors get venerated, which victories are celebrated, which gods are most closely identified with the crown, you can keep elites aligned and peripheral chiefs impressed. People come to your capital not just to pay taxes or plead court cases, but to witness and participate in the ceremonies that, in their minds, keep the universe running. Put all these pieces together, and you don't get a carbon copy of Rome. You get a different model of empire. Rome spread like a web of fortified roads and urban colonies around a sea it turned into its private lake. Kush stretched along a river and radiated out on camel trails and pilgrimage paths into deserts and savannas. Rome loved written law codes and citizen assemblies. Kush folded power through temples, royal kin groups, and ritual obligations. Rome standardized Latin and imposed a fairly uniform administrative vocabulary. Kush, especially in the Meroitic era, ran a multilingual, multicultural machine that could talk to Egypt, negotiate with desert nomads, and still speak to inner African partners in idioms they understood. But the ambition, the sense of ruling not just a cluster of villages but a world, feels very familiar. This is the framework we need in mind as the story shifts again, because after the shock of losing Egypt, the kings of Kush don't give up on empire, they recalibrate it. The centre of gravity glides further south, away from Napata's old temples and toward a city that has been growing quietly in the background, Meroe. On paper, it looks like just another royal town. In reality, it will become something much bigger. An industrial powerhouse of iron, a hub of trade, a laboratory for new forms of kingship and culture. If Napata was the Kushite gateway into the pharaonic world, Meroe will be the place where Kush leans fully into its own African networks and starts building a different kind of imperial future. So why move the heart of the kingdom? Napata had the sacred past, the old temples, the memory of ruling Egypt, but it also had baggage. It sat closer to Egyptian and then Roman frontiers. It was more exposed to northern invasions, to meddling from Nile Delta politics, to anyone who wanted to march upriver and take a swing at Kush. Meroe, further south, offered something else, room to breathe. Ecologically, it's in a sweet spot. The Nile splits into channels and seasonal streams. The surrounding land opens into savannas that get more rainfall than the narrow desert belt around Napata. That means more reliable agriculture, more pasture for cattle, more wood for fuel. If you're planning to feed big cities and run big industries, this matters. It also put the crown closer to inner African roots. From Meroe, it's easier to angle west toward the Sahel, south toward the Upper Nile and its tributaries, and east toward the Red Sea via several corridors. Instead of perching right under Egypt's nose, the royal court could sit at the junction of African networks that outsiders barely understood. You're still on the Great North-South River Highway, but you're now closer to the sources of the goods everyone wants. And for security, distance is a weapon. Any army coming from the Mediterranean world had to push through hundreds of kilometres, across cataracts, hostile stretches of desert, and fortified choke points before it could even dream of reaching Meroe. Meanwhile, the Kushite king could call on local allies, draw supplies from nearby fields, and retreat along routes his enemies didn't know. Napata faced north. Meroe turned the state's face inward, toward Africa. So what did this southern capital actually look like? Archaeology paints the outline of a real city, not just a ceremonial camp. At its core were temples, big ones, stone pylons, columned halls, courtyards and shrines dedicated to Amen and other gods important to Kush. Like at Napata, religion lived in the centre of urban life. Processions would have moved through these spaces. Oracles would have been consulted. Festivals would have turned the city into a sea of people. Near the temples sat royal palaces, multi-room complexes with reception halls, inner courtyards, storage areas, and private quarters. These were not isolated fortresses. They were plugged into the urban grid of streets and smaller houses, a political and administrative heart where scribes, stewards, and officials worked. Then, around and between these monumental cores, you get neighbourhoods, mud brick houses clustered along lanes, workshops for pottery, metal, textiles, areas that show regular planning, walls aligned, streets forming recognisable patterns. This isn't random growth. It suggests city officials deciding where things go, how movement should flow, where markets and industrial quarters should be placed. And then there is the industrial zone that made Meroe famous, the Iron Quarter. If you walk that part of the site today, you're basically walking on slag, waste from iron smelting, sometimes meters deep. Furnaces, tuyères, the clay pipes that once carried air into the fires, broken crucibles, iron blooms. It's a dense archaeological signature of metalworking on a massive scale. This is why Meroe gets called an Iron Age metropolis. For a long time, scholars imagined whole forests being cut down to feed these furnaces. The famous image is of black smoke hanging over the city, as slaves and workers smelted ore day and night, turning Meroe into the Birmingham of ancient Africa. The reality is more nuanced. We know from the slag and furnace remains that iron was produced in enormous quantities compared to earlier Nubian sites. We can see evidence of different smelting techniques, suggesting innovation and maybe experimentation. We see signs of reworking and recycling, not just making new iron, but constantly reforging and repairing tools and weapons. What we don't fully know is scale and organisation. Was iron production a tightly controlled royal monopoly, with the palace supervising everything? Or was it a mixed system, where royal workshops coexisted with temple-based operations and private smiths making a living on the side? How far did Meroitic iron circulate, just through Kush, or into neighbouring regions, or even as far as Mediterranean markets? Those questions are still being argued. New furnace datings and slag analyses keep tweaking the timeline and the volume estimates. But whether it was an ancient steel mill on the level of modern fantasy or just a very large, regionally dominant industry, the point remains. Meroe turned iron into power. Iron tools mean deeper ploughing, more efficient clearing of fields, better axes, better carpentry, more reliable nails and fittings for boats and wagons. Iron weapons mean spears and swords that don't shatter as easily. Arrowheads you can mass-produce armour and fittings for horses. In a world where many communities still relied heavily on stone or scarce bronze, an iron-rich state has options. And iron plugged directly into trade. Picture the flow. From the south and west, caravans and rivercraft brought gold from distant mines, ivory tusks, leopard and lion skins, exotic hardwoods, live animals, giraffes, monkeys, birds. From forest edges and savannas, aromatic resins and incense, certain rare stones, maybe slaves captured in local conflicts or as punishment. From the east, via routes that touched the Red Sea, came Arabian incense, Indian Ocean spices, and goods that had hopped across multiple hands. Pearls, glass, maybe even a trickle of textiles from further east. From the north came Mediterranean goods, wine in amphorae, glass vessels, fine pottery, bronze or silver items, sometimes coins that Kushites didn't necessarily use as money, but as bullion, jewellery, or status symbols. Meroe sat in the middle of all this, taxing, redistributing, transforming. Gold could be turned into jewellery for the court and offerings for temples, or exported as ingots. Ivory might be carved locally or sent on in raw form. Skins became luxury garments. Incense burned in royal and temple rituals, or moved north as part of diplomatic gifts. Iron tools and weapons could be payment for allies, incentives for chiefs on the frontier, or stocked for royal armies. This is where Meroe stops being just a big town and starts looking like a node in a continental network. Inside that network, another revolution was happening. Writing. Earlier Kushite rulers had leaned heavily on Egyptian hieroglyphs when they wanted to carve things in stone. By the time Meroe was flourishing, we start seeing something new, the Meroitic script. There are two main forms, one adapted for carving in stone, more formal and angular. The other, a cursive form written on more perishable materials, papyrus, leather, maybe wooden tablets. Both recorded a local language, not Egyptian. This matters. It tells us Kush was no longer content to express its identity solely through a borrowed system. The state had the confidence and the administrative need to write its own language, its own way. We can read Meroitic phonetically now, we can sound out many words, but we still don't fully understand the language. It's like being able to pronounce a foreign alphabet perfectly, while only recognizing some of the vocabulary, proper names, royal titles, some standard phrases, religious terms, those we can identify. The rest is still a puzzle. That partial decipherment has two big consequences. First, it confirms a lot of what archaeology hinted at. A structured bureaucracy, officials with specialized titles, a ritual calendar, legal and administrative acts being recorded. This was not a purely oral kingdom improvising policy. It had scribes and archives. Second, it reminds us how much we still don't know. Those untranslated texts probably contain internal histories, court politics, land grants, maybe even literary or didactic works. Until more of the language yields, a large chunk of Kush's own voice is muffled. We're reconstructing an empire while half its paperwork is still locked. Even with that silence, a sense of cultural confidence comes through. In art, Meroitic develops a style that is recognizably its own. Yes, some statues still wear Egyptian crowns or strike pharaonic poses, but proportions shift. Faces, hairstyles, jewellery, clothing elements reflect Nubian and inner African aesthetics. Gods appear with attributes familiar from Egypt but paired with local symbols, local sacred animals, local landscapes. In religion, Amun remains important, especially at the older cult centre of Napata, but other deities rise. Lion-headed gods and goddesses, local protective spirits, royal ancestors, all woven into a pantheon that doesn't feel like simple imitation. Temples in and around Meroe show rituals that blend Nile traditions with desert and savanna cults. Royal titles tell the same story. Kushite kings still sometimes claim pharaonic echoes when it's useful, but Meroitic inscriptions stress titles rooted in their own tradition. They call themselves not just kings of Kush, but lords of specific regions, masters of particular sacred places, possessors of authority that doesn't need Egyptian validation. This is an empire that has stopped asking for external approval. It trades with the Mediterranean, appropriates what it finds useful, but it doesn't define itself as a shadow copy of Egypt or a peripheral client of Rome. It's building in its cities, its ironworks, its script, and its art, a distinct civilization calibrated to the African worlds it actually rules. And those worlds are not sealed off. As Meroe grows into this iron-trading, script-writing capital, Mediterranean superpowers are watching. Ptolemaic Egypt eyes Kush as both partner and rival. Later, Rome inherits that position and has to decide, is this southern kingdom a client, a threat, a source of luxury goods, or a stubborn frontier problem? The next turn in the story is about that relationship, how a proud river empire forged in African networks collides with, negotiates with, and sometimes bleeds with the giants of the Mediterranean. If you had walked into the royal court of Kush expecting a line of stern-bearded kings and silent queens in the background, you'd be in for a shock. In this empire, women didn't just sit beside power. Sometimes they were power. Greek and Roman writers kept stumbling over a title they didn't really understand. They recorded it as Candace and turned it into what sounded like a personal name. In the inscriptions of Kush, it's Kandake. Kandake wasn't one woman, it was a title. It could mean Queen Mother, reigning queen, or a royal woman with sovereign authority, depending on the period. In some reigns, a Kandake appears alongside a king, almost as a co-ruler. In others, she stands alone at the top. On temple walls and pyramid chapels, Kandaks are carved the same size as kings, or even larger, smiting enemies, receiving offerings, front and centre in rituals. This is not decorative equality, it's political. Kush's royal ideology made descent through women matter, a lot. The Queen Mother seems to have been a key source of legitimacy. A man might become king because he was the right kind of son, or sometimes the right kind of sister's son, of a royal woman. That's not unusual in parts of Africa, where matrilineal principles, tracing rank or inheritance through women, sit alongside male offices. In Kush, it meant that you could not separate kingship from the women who produced kings. Priests understood this very well, and they sat at the other pillar of authority. At Napata, and later even while the political centre shifted to Meroe, the great temple of Amun remained a powerhouse. It was there, according to later traditions and hints from inscriptions, that oracles could proclaim who should rule. A candidate's bloodline, the support of the priesthood, the verdict of the god, those together formed a package of legitimacy. Think of succession less as a simple father-to-son handoff, and more as a negotiated ritual event. A new ruler appears before the god. Processions are held, offerings made. The royal names are proclaimed, sometimes blending Egyptian-style throne names with distinctly Kushite titles. The Kandake may be present, visually and ritually confirming the transfer. Somewhere behind all this pageantry, factions in the court and in the priesthood are jockeying for influence. but what the public sees is cosmic order renewed. We know this not from tidy narrative chronicles, Kush hasn't left us those, or they haven't survived, but from fragments. Royal pyramids aligned in neat cemeteries, each with chapels showing the king or queen in ritual scenes. Inscriptions echoing formulas about beloved of Amun, lord of Kush, great Kandake. Occasional graffiti and stele that record land grants, dedications or victories. From these bits you can glimpse the scaffolding of government. There were titled officials. The Meroitic inscriptions refer to scribes, stewards, governors of districts, overseers of royal domains. Some titles repeat across several reigns, suggesting offices, not one-off jobs. There were words for palace, and for specific administrative buildings. We see references to boundaries, to estates belonging to temples or the crown. And where you have estates, you almost certainly have taxation. Kush didn't leave us detailed tax codes, but the archaeological record hints at a state that could extract and redistribute resources. Royal and temple granaries appear in major centres. Large storage jars cluster in official compounds. Certain luxury goods, gold, ivory, imported wine, turn up disproportionately in palaces and temples, not in ordinary houses. This suggests a system where farmers paid in kind, grain, livestock, labour, while merchants and caravan leaders paid in goods, tolls or service. The crown and temples then used those flows to feed scribes, soldiers, artisans and the ritual calendar. Control over production shows up in craft organisation too. At Meroe and other sites you don't just find random scatterings of kilns and workshops. You find zoned areas, pottery quarters, metalworking clusters, textile-related spaces. Some are embedded in neighbourhoods. Others hug palace or temple complexes. That pattern implies a mixed economy, independent or family-run workshops existing alongside, or sometimes under the shadow of big institutional employers. If you were a royal smith working near the palace furnaces, your output might go straight into royal armories or be earmarked for diplomatic gifts. If you were a potter in a suburb, you might supply everyday cooking pots and storage vessels to the market and pay dues for the privilege. But what did this world feel like on the ground? Step back from kings and kandakis and imagine a street in Meroe. Most people lived in mud brick houses, not monumental stone. Some were small, a couple of rooms around a courtyard packed into dense blocks. Others spread out more with multiple courtyards, private wells and storage spaces, signs of wealth. Floors show traces of hearths. Grinding stones sit worn down from years of use. Animal bones in rubbish pits tell us what ended up on the table. Cattle for the well-off, goats and sheep more commonly, fish from the Nile, wild game when available. Charred grains and seeds hint at sorghum and other cereals, supplemented by fruits and vegetables where water allowed. Cooking likely meant stews, breads, porridges, familiar patterns in the Nile Valley, but adapted to local crops and tastes. Beer brewed from grain probably flowed in both everyday gatherings and ritual feasts. Crafts stitched this daily life to the wider empire. In house compounds, small-scale spinning and weaving would have produced cloth. Nearby workshops hammered copper, worked iron, carved bone and ivory. Some individuals specialised, others mixed farming with part-time craft. Social hierarchy was visible in the objects people used. Fine imported glass, painted ceramics, intricate jewellery clustered at the top, plainer wares, coarser fabrics, simpler huts marked lives with less surplus to spare. Slavery almost certainly existed. Captives from war, debt slaves, people sold out of desperation. They are hard to see directly in the archaeology, but the presence of large households, estate agriculture, and military activity makes it very likely that forced labour underpinned part of Kush's prosperity. Hovering above all this, religion did more than soothe souls. It organised power. Temples were not just places to pray, they were economic engines. Each major sanctuary, Napata's Amun, Meroe's temples, regional cult centres, held land, herds, and personnel. Priests, singers, guards, gardeners, scribes, craftspeople, all fed by offerings and by income from temple estates. When people brought grain, cattle, or incense as gifts to the gods, Part of that went into supporting this apparatus. In return, temples offered rituals that legitimized rulers, marked seasonal cycles, and kept the social order anchored in sacred time. Festivals drew crowds from surrounding regions, turning religious centres into magnets for trade and information. If you wanted to know what the court was planning, what distant prince had sent gifts, what oracles had pronounced, you listened to what was said and done at the great sanctuaries. Out in the provinces, smaller shrines and local gods linked villages into the same web. A king might visit a regional sanctuary, leave an inscription, refurbish a temple, or endow it with land. That wasn't mere piety, it was politics. By honouring local sacred places, the crown acknowledged regional identities while tying them into a broader Kushite framework. Temple networks, in effect, helped govern. And yet, for all this structure, there's a question we still can't answer cleanly. How tightly did the kings of Meroe actually control their distant territories? The archaeological footprint of Kush is uneven. In some zones, around the main Nile corridor in certain fortress-like sites, you see strong royal presence, inscriptions, elite tombs, standardized architecture. In others, you see more local variation, communities that look loosely tethered rather than micromanaged. It's possible Kush ruled as a layered empire. Direct authority in the core, especially between Napata and Meroe, where inspectors, tax collectors, and royal garrisons could operate regularly. Further out, a patchwork of allied chiefs, client communities, and trade partners who recognized Kushite overlordship when it mattered, sending tribute, hosting officials, contributing troops, but otherwise ran their own affairs. Writing doesn't solve this mystery yet because most Meroitic texts we can place come from the heartland. When we do see royal names in outlying regions, it's often in the context of temples or funerary monuments, not day-to-day administration. So we're left with a picture that's both clear and blurry. Clear enough to see a court where Kandakas and kings share the stage, where priests whisper in royal ears, where scribes tally goods in ink and on clay, clear enough to see farmers sowing fields with iron tools, artisans feeding city markets, caravans filing into temple forecourts with incense curling into the sky. Blurry when we ask exactly how commands from Meroe translated into obedience, tax and loyalty hundreds of kilometres away. That uncertainty matters, because it puts a human scale back into the story. Kush was not just a faceless iron machine or a list of royal names. It was made of families arguing over inheritance, priests debating omens, metalworkers haggling over ore prices, soldiers boasting about border skirmishes, merchants praying their boats made it through the cataracts. And it was those same humans, governed by queens and kings, anchored by temples, woven into a hierarchy that was powerful but not all-seeing, who would soon find themselves staring north at an unfamiliar kind of empire, an empire that called itself Rome. When Rome arrived, it didn't creep in. It crashed. In 30 BCE, after Cleopatra and Mark Antony lost to Octavian, the last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt killed herself, and Egypt slid overnight from Hellenistic kingdom to Roman province. For Rome, it was a prize of unimaginable wealth. Grain, gold, papyrus, a strategic hinge between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. For Kush, it meant something else. For centuries, Nubia to the south had been dealing with Egyptian states that were rich but familiar. Pharaohs, even foreign ones, spoke the language of the Nile. They worshipped Amun. They married into local elites. They came and went, but the political grammar didn't change that much. Rome was different. New language, new army system, new tax regime, same old hunger for resources. Almost immediately, the Roman state began thinking in terms of frontiers. They pushed their administration up the Nile, fortified key towns, and treated the First Cataract region, around Aswan and the island of Elephantine, as the southern edge of their direct control, on paper at least. Because on the other side of that imagined line, the kingdom of Kush was very much alive, with its own queens, kings and armies, and that line was not a wall, it was a membrane. Our main written window into what happened next comes from Roman authors, Strabo, Cassius, a few inscriptions, so we have to handle them carefully. They like to cast Rome as the inevitable victor, barbarians as foils, and inconvenient details as footnotes. But even filtered through their bias, the story they tell about Kush is not one of easy domination. It starts with a raid. Somewhere around 25 BCE, during the reign of Augustus, Kushite forces moved north into Roman-held territory in Lower Nubia. Strabo describes Ethiopians under a Candace attacking towns like Syene, Aswan, Elephantine and Philae. Temples were damaged, Roman statues were carried off. There are hints that this wasn't just random looting. They hit administrative centres and symbols of Roman power. Archaeology backs up at least part of this. At Denda and other sites in northern Nubia, there's evidence of conflict and disruption around this time. It looks less like a few bandits and more like an organised strike. Who led it? The Romans just say Candace, treating it as a proper name. Most historians connect this with the Kandake Amanirinas, a ruling queen of Kush, whose name appears in Meroitic inscriptions from this period. In reliefs, she's shown powerful, thick-limbed, with an aura of command. In one scene, she appears blinded in one eye. Some think this reflects a real injury, possibly from war. The picture that forms, when you line up the stories in the stones, is of a queen who did not accept a passive subordinate role for Kush in a newly Roman Nile valley. Rome, of course, hit back. Augustus sent a prefect of Egypt, Gaius Petronius, south with legions. Roman accounts claim impressive numbers, tens of thousands of soldiers, cities laid waste, enemies scattering. That's standard bragging language. But there's little doubt Petronius mounted a serious punitive campaign. He drove into Nubia, recaptured the frontier towns, and advanced beyond them into what had been Kushite-administered land, taking places like Napata, the old sacred capital. Strabo says Napata was sacked, its population taken captive. Petronius then pulled back and established a new forward position at Premnis, probably Qasr Ibrim, a fortified outpost in what had once been the buffer zone. On a standard Roman frontier, that might have been the end of the story. Empire asserts itself. Locals are punished. A line is drawn, garrisoned, taxed. That's not what happened. Kushite forces continue to operate in the region. Strabo mentions a counterattack against Premnis, repelled by the Romans. We don't get tactical details, but the bare fact that Kush was able to threaten a Roman stronghold after a major punitive expedition says a lot about their resilience and military organisation. Then something very un-Roman for this era: negotiations. A Kushite delegation travelled north to meet Augustus's representatives, possibly even Augustus himself, depending on how literally we take the ancient account. One tradition has them meeting at Samos in the Aegean, another suggests terms were handled in Egypt. Either way, you have envoys from sub-Saharan Africa sitting down across from the ruler of the Mediterranean superpower to hash out a deal. We don't have a Kushite version of the treaty. What we do have comes from Roman authors and from the archaeology of the border that followed, and that evidence points in one direction. Kush got a surprisingly good bargain. According to Strabo, the Romans agreed to withdraw from certain territories they had occupied in Lower Nubia, essentially pulling the effective frontier back north. More remarkable still, he says the Kushites secured exemption from paying tribute to Rome. In other words, this was not formalized as a vassalage where Kush owed annual payments. It was a peace between two states. Some scholars wonder if Strabo overstated the generosity, or if he misunderstood tax arrangements. That's possible. But the long-term pattern suggests Kush walked away with genuine leverage. After this settlement, we don't see evidence of Rome trying to conquer Kush outright. We don't see repeat massive campaigns. We see a stabilized frontier that lasts, with minor variations, for generations. That stability is itself a data point. Rome tended to push harder against neighbours it thought it could swallow. Here, after an initial clash, it chose to live with a powerful African kingdom on its southern edge. So what did life look like in this negotiated borderland, where Roman eagles and Kushite lions stared at each other across the desert? Think less hard wall, more busy corridor. Along the Nile, between Aswan and the Second Cataract, temples and forts coexisted with caravan routes and river traffic. Rome invested in temples like Philae and Denda, decorating them with hieroglyphic texts that presented Augustus and his successors as pharaohs in good standing. But these sacred spaces remained important for Nubian communities too. Pilgrims from further south likely still came to worship, give offerings, meet traders. Border control in practice meant checkpoints, customs posts and garrisons, not an impassable line. Goods moved both ways: gold and iron from Kushite lands, exotic animal products, ivory and slaves. In return, wine, glass, fine ceramics, Mediterranean textiles, and Roman coinage. Taxes followed the movement. On the Roman side, customs officials collected duties on imports and exports. Inscriptions in Greek and Demotic record tax categories, tolls and exemptions. Some of that revenue came from Nubian and Kushite merchants moving their caravans or boatloads of goods north. On the Kushite side, we can infer similar exactions. Tolls at river choke points, fees for market access, perhaps royal monopolies on particularly valuable items. For local communities, this could be both burden and opportunity. A village near a fort might have to supply grain or fodder to a Roman garrison, but it could also sell to soldiers with cash to spend. Nubian boatmen who knew the cataracts could hire their skills to Roman officials bringing tax grain downstream, then turn around and work for Kushite traders going up. Culturally, the frontier was porous. In Roman-controlled Nubia, graves and small shrines show a mix of Egyptian, local Nubian, and Roman elements. Traditional gods alongside imperial cult. Egyptian-style tomb superstructures containing people buried with Roman goods. Greek names appearing next to old local ones. Southward, in Kushite territory, you start to see imported Roman items in elite tombs and settlement layers. Glassware, amphora fragments, bits of metalwork, objects that had travelled hundreds of miles and shifted hands many times. Ideas travelled with them. Kush certainly knew what Rome was and how it operated. The presence of Roman goods, and perhaps even Roman craftsmen or merchants in Meroitic lands, would have given Kushite elites concrete examples of foreign technologies, artistic styles, and administrative practices. That doesn't mean they copied them wholesale. It means they had more raw material to work with. On the Roman side, officials and soldiers stationed in Egypt developed their own mental map of Ethiopia to the south, a powerful kingdom ruled by queens as well as kings, capable of fielding armies, making treaties, and disrupting border trade if angered. Not a faceless wilderness, but a state you had to negotiate with. All of this chips away at the old picture of Rome mechanically civilizing a passive south. What we see instead is a frontier where power was balanced enough that Rome compromised, and where Kush used diplomacy and strategic raids to defend its interests. The peace after Petronius and Amanirenas didn't mean nothing changed. It meant change slowed down, thickened into routine. For roughly a century and more, the Nile frontier between Egypt and Kush remained comparatively quiet. Trade patterns stabilized. Local elites on both sides learned how to profit from the new order. Kush continued to mint its own trajectory from Meroe, ruling its heartlands and outlying networks without Roman governors telling it what to do. But long quiets can be deceptive. Beyond the frontier forts and treaty lines, new pressures were building, shifts in trade routes, internal strains, ecological changes, and the slow turning of global economies. None of them looked like a single hammer blow from Rome. They looked like a creeping set of stresses that, over time, would test how long an Iron Age empire in the African interior could keep its balance. Before we get to that unravelling, though, we need to understand what Kush was defending. Not just its borders and its trade, but its soul, its gods, its art, its language, and the way it told its own story to itself. If you stood in Meroe at the height of Kushite power and asked, "Who rules here?" the people could have pointed to the palace, to the Kanda K, or the king. But if you asked, "Who really rules here?" they would have pointed somewhere else, to the gods. Kushite religion wasn't a copy pasted from Egypt. It was a dense, evolving web of beliefs that tied the kingdom to the Nile, to the desert, and to its own ancient past. At the centre of that web, especially from the Napatan period onward, was Amun. Not just any Amun, though. This was Amun of Jebel Barkal, the pure mountain near Napata, where a distinctive pinnacle of rock stands out against the sky. Egyptian priests had already seen this cliff and said, "Yes, that's a sacred place." Kush went further. They turned it into a cosmic anchor. In their theology, Amun lived there. He chose kings there. At the temple of Amun at Jebel Bakal, statues and reliefs show Kushite rulers receiving crowns, life, and authority directly from the god. The message is clear. Our right to rule doesn't come from Egypt. It comes from the same divine source Egypt once claimed, and that source is now centered in our land. But Amun wasn't alone. Older Nubian deities never went away. Lions, rams, serpents, powerful female figures, local cults and spirits tied to particular stretches of river, hills and oases stayed in the religious landscape. Over time, many of them were blended with Egyptian gods, creating beings that don't quite match anything on the Nile to the north. A lion-headed war god here might be labelled with an Egyptian name in hieroglyphs, but the way he's drawn, armed and worshipped looks distinctly Kushite. Isis, Osiris and other Egyptian figures also had a strong presence, especially in temples built in Egyptian style, yet even there you get twists. In some scenes, Kushite queens are shown in positions of religious prominence that would be unusual in mainstream Egyptian art. Priestesses and royal women appear as key intermediaries, suggesting that female ritual power in Kush was not just an occasional exception, but part of the system. By the time we reach Meroe, the religious picture is even more layered. We start seeing gods with clearly local names in Meroitic script, alongside older Egyptian-style deities. There are hints of syncretic cults that combined Nubian, Egyptian, and maybe even more distant influences brought in by trade. Pilgrims carved graffiti at temples. Small shrines and offering tables appear in towns and cemeteries. Religion had roots in royal ideology, but its branches reached ordinary people. If you want to see how seriously Kush took the afterlife, you don't look first at texts, you look at the skyline. Because unlike Egypt under the later pharaohs, Kush never stopped building pyramids. Drive today through the sands of modern Sudan, and you find them rising in clusters, steep, narrow, sharp-angled pyramids, often packed close together on ridges above the Nile. At Napatan and especially at Meroe, royal cemeteries form dense forests of stone. They look Egyptian at a glance. Pyramids are hard to mistake, but the details are different. Kushite pyramids are far smaller in base than the great Giza monuments, and much steeper, sometimes almost needle-like. Instead of containing massive internal chambers, they usually have the burial rooms cut into the rock beneath or in front, accessed by stairs or shafts leading under the monument. On the east side, a small chapel was built where relatives and priests brought offerings. These chapels are where the story really opens up. Walls carved in low relief show the deceased king or queen standing before gods, receiving life symbols, wearing crowns that mix Egyptian and uniquely Kushite elements. In some scenes, rulers appear massive and powerful, with rounded bodies and strong limbs, emphasizing fertility, abundance, and authority. The iconography can look familiar, sun discs, ankhs, falcons, but the compositions and body types don't match any Egyptian canon exactly. They belong to a different aesthetic. Grave goods tell us more. Royal and elite burials at Meroe contain jewellery of extraordinary craftsmanship, gold collars, inlaid stones, intricate earrings and rings. There were weapons, imported luxury items, finely painted ceramics, iron tools and amulets. Even in more modest graves, people were buried with beads, pottery, personal ornaments, objects meant to travel with them into another world. And that pottery, those beads, those everyday objects are part of Kush's artistic fingerprint. Kushite ceramics develop their own styles over time. Early on you see continuities with older Nubian traditions, burnished black-topped wares, incised patterns, alongside Egyptian forms. Later, in the Meroitic period, you get beautifully painted fine wares, thin-walled cups and bowls decorated with red, black and white designs. Some carry geometric bands, others show plants, animals, even human figures. They were not just containers, they were moving canvases. Jewellery followed the same logic. gold from Nubian mines fed workshops that produced pieces with an astonishing mix of precision and flair. Lotus motifs appear, yes, but so do local symbols, lion heads, ram heads, stacked geometric shapes that don't match anything in Egypt exactly. Artisans played with texture, granulation, filigree, stamped patterns, turning small objects into dense statements of status and taste. On temple walls and stelae, royal imagery did heavy ideological lifting. Kings are shown smiting enemies in scenes that echo Egyptian pharaonic art, but the enemies are often labelled differently. The style of dress, the proportions, the way the king's body is rendered all carry a distinctly Kushite flavour. Queens, especially Kandaks, appear front and centre, trampling foes, wielding weapons, overseeing rituals. In some images, a queen dwarfs the king in size. That's not a passive consort. That's a co-ruler, or even the dominant figure. Taken together, these visual choices broadcast a message. We know the international visual language of power, but we also insist on looking like ourselves. Which brings us to something even more elusive: voice. For centuries, Kush wrote in borrowed scripts. Egyptian hieroglyphs and cursive forms suited perfectly to carving on stone or writing on papyrus. Many Napatan inscriptions are imperfectly respectable, if sometimes slightly idiosyncratic Egyptian. That was the prestige medium of the Nile world. Then, around the 2nd century BCE, a shift. We start finding texts in a new script and to some extent a new language. Meroitic. There are two main forms, one adapted from Egyptian hieroglyphs for monumental use, and another cursive version for ink on more perishable materials. Side by side with Egyptian, they mark a deliberate choice. The state of Kush wanted to write its own language, not just translate itself into someone else's. We can read the letters, we can sound out the words, but we can't fully understand most of what they say. Meroitic has been partially deciphered, names, titles, some common words, but the deeper grammar and vocabulary remain debated. So when we look at those long columns on stelae, or the lines painted inside coffins, or the short notes scratched on pottery, we know we're looking at law codes, dedications, religious texts, maybe tax records and royal decrees. We can tell there was an administrative apparatus using this script to manage an empire. We just can't quite hear the sentences yet. That ignorance can trick us into underestimating what was there. From the inside, these texts would have been as ordinary and powerful as any Roman edict or Greek contract. From the outside, they look like silence. But they're not silence. They're just a language we haven't learned to listen to. Meanwhile, Greek, Latin and Egyptian sources were busy talking about Kush in their own ways. To Herodotus and his successors, Ethiopia was a place of wonders at the edge of the world. Long-lived people, strange customs, exotic luxuries. Roman authors picked up the same themes and added their own spin. Brave fighters led by warrior queens, occasional troublemakers on the border, useful allies or dangerous neighbours depending on the year. They rarely bothered with the complexities. Kush could be a backdrop, a foil, a rhetorical device. Kush's own monuments pushed back with a different narrative. On temple walls from Jebel Barkal to Meroe, we don't see a peripheral frontier backwater, we see a centre. Gods standing in Kushite landscapes crown Kushite rulers. Victory scenes don't cast them as border raiders, but as rightful masters of river and desert. Long genealogies link kings and queens to divine favour, and ancient lineages rooted in the land itself. From one angle, you have outside texts that flatten Kush into stereotype. From another, you have Kushite texts and images insisting on depth, continuity and legitimacy. Neither picture is complete on its own, but there's a pattern that emerges when you lay them together. This was not a culture living off borrowed prestige. It was a civilization that took foreign elements, yes, gods, scripts, architectural forms, and reworked them so thoroughly they became something new. Continuity and innovation, not imitation. You see it in how Amun of Egypt becomes Amun of Jebel Barkal, in how pyramids shrink and sharpen but multiply across the desert, in how Egyptian signs are reshaped into Meroitic script, in how queens step into and beyond roles defined elsewhere. And yet, for most of modern history, all of that has hovered in the margins of global memory, partly because Meroitic is only half understood, partly because ancient Mediterranean writers told the story from their own angle, and later historians believed them, partly because the physical remains of Kush lie in regions that were hard for early European archaeology to reach, and frankly easy for imperial narratives to ignore. The result is a strange disconnect. On the ground in Sudan, an entire sacred landscape of pyramids, temples, and royal cities still exists. In many textbooks, it barely appears at all. To understand how that could happen, how an empire with its own gods, script, and artistic voice could be pushed to the footnotes, we have to follow the story beyond its golden age, into its stresses, fractures, and afterlives. Because the richness you've just seen didn't vanish overnight. It faded, shifted, was repurposed, and then, for a long time, was misread. The next step is to ask why. If you freeze the story of Kush at its brightest moment, it's tempting to imagine it just staying that way. Pyramids on the horizon, iron furnaces glowing, caravans coming and going, queens and kings presiding over a stable order blessed by the gods. History doesn't work like that. Empires don't usually fall for one reason. They fray, they get squeezed, they adapt until they can't, and what comes after often looks less like a clean break and more like a long, messy rearrangement of the same people, the same land, under new rules. Kush is no exception. Start with the environment. For centuries, the stretch of the Nile that Kush controlled gave it a stable backbone. Floodplains, pasture, access to the savannas and the Red Sea fringe. But climate isn't a background painting. It moves. Geoarchaeological work around Meroe and further north suggests that, over the late 1st millennium BCE and into the 1st centuries CE, the region got drier overall. Not a Hollywood one day it rained, the next day it didn't, but a slow ratcheting. Rainfall patterns shifting, some tributaries becoming less reliable, grasslands retreating, tree cover thinning. Now add people to that. Kush had spent centuries exploiting its landscape hard. Forests near Meroe were cut for fuel, iron smelting eats wood like a furnace eats coal, herds grazed the margins, fields were opened and reopened along the river. Some scholars argue that this long, intense use of land around key cities contributed to local degradation. Fewer trees, more erosion, less resilience when the climate turned against them. We don't have a signed confession from a Meroitic official saying, "We cut too many trees, that was on us." What we do have are thick layers of slag from furnaces, evidence of industrial-scale metallurgy, and signs that some areas around the city became more arid over time. One plausible picture is a feedback loop. Climate dries, people push the land harder, the land pushes back. At the same time, Kush's economic world was being redrawn. For a long stretch, Kush sat in the middle of north-south traffic. Gold, ivory, animal skins, exotic woods, and enslaved people moved up the Nile toward Egypt and the Mediterranean. Manufactured goods and prestige items came back down. Control the river corridors and overland routes and you could tax, skim, and sometimes monopolize that flow. Then the map shifted sideways. By the last centuries BCE, sailors in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean were learning new tricks. Hellenistic and then Roman merchants figured out how to use monsoon winds to sail directly between Egyptian ports on the Red Sea and harbours in Arabia and India. Instead of inching along coastlines and relying entirely on overland middlemen, They could cut across open water in big seasonal arcs. That was catastrophic for old business models. For old. Goods that had once trudged overland through Nubia could now bypass the interior entirely. Aromatics, spices, fine textiles, even some African exports began to move along east-west sea lanes and Red Sea coastal routes, rather than up and down the Nile. Ports in what is now Eritrea, Yemen, and the Horn of Africa became crucial nodes. Inland powers like Kush suddenly found themselves competing with coastal players in a game whose rules they hadn't written. Rome and later Byzantium made that worse, and better at the same time. On one level, Roman demand for ivory, animals, and luxury goods kept African exports profitable. Texts like the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea describe trade with Ethiopians on the Red Sea coast and beyond. On another level, Roman and then Byzantine authorities invested heavily in Red Sea harbours and alliances with coastal states. Their interest in the deep interior was limited. Why negotiate with an inland kingdom if you can get what you want at a port? Enter one of those coastal-leaning powers, Aksum. Rising in the highlands of what's now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, the kingdom of Aksum grew into a major regional force between the 1st and 4th centuries CE. It minted its own coins. It engaged with Roman, Arabian and Indian merchants. It controlled or influenced ports that plugged directly into the new maritime networks. To Aksum, Kush was not an eternal giant. It was a neighbour, sometimes a partner, sometimes a rival, sometimes a tempting target. We have inscriptions from an Aksumite king Ezana in the 4th century CE, boasting of campaigns into Noba and Kasu. Interpretations vary, but many scholars see in these texts a memory of Aksumite military action against the remnants of Kushite power along the Nile. Not necessarily a single knockout blow, more like a sign that the balance had tilted. The old inland empire was now something coastal powers could invade, influence, and pick apart. But again, we should resist the urge to say, Aksum destroyed Kush, the end. The archaeological story is messier, and in some ways more interesting. If you walk through the material record of the late Meroitic and post-Meroitic periods, you don't see an empire standing strong one year and vanish the next. You see fragmentation. Royal pyramid building at Meroe slows and then stops. Temples see fewer monumental additions. In some regions, monumental tombs shrink, while elaborate graves pop up for people who don't seem to be central state royals. That suggests local elites gaining relative power as the old central court loses its grip. Burial practices shift. In the heartland, you move from classic Meroitic pyramids and chapels to smaller tumuli, earthen mounds, often with distinctive grave goods that mix old motifs with new styles. In some areas, grave orientation changes. The arrangement of bodies, the offerings, the symbols painted on pottery start to diverge from earlier, more standardized patterns. Cities change too, or quietly hollow out. At Meroe itself, later layers show continued occupation, but with signs of contraction. Reuse of older buildings, more modest new structures, fewer big public works. Other sites that had once been important administrative or religious centres take on more local, regional roles, or fade from use entirely. These are the fingerprints of political power breaking into pieces, central authority not evaporating in a day, but leaking away into competing chiefdoms, tribal polities, and rising neighbours. What then do we actually know about the end of Meroe? We don't have a neatly dated inscription saying, in year X the Meroitic kingdom fell. Classical authors get vague right when we want them to be precise. Later Nubian and Ethiopian traditions remember ancient conflicts but blur dates and identities. Archaeology gives us a sequence. Last royal names, last dated inscriptions, last major constructions, but no single cataclysm. Most scholars put the collapse of Meroitic state structures somewhere in the 3rd to early 4th centuries CE. After that, we're clearly in a new political landscape. Groups referred to in external sources as the Nobatai, or Noba, and the Blemmies appear more frequently. These weren't new human beings who teleported in. They were confederations, tribal coalitions and regional powers, some probably emerging from within the old Nubian population, others from desert and savanna margins, that began to dominate different stretches of the Nile corridor. Later, by the 6th century, we see the rise of Christian Nubian kingdoms, Nubadia, Makuria, Alodia, each with its own capital, churches and diplomatic relations with Byzantium and Egypt. They ruled many of the same lands Kush had ruled. They sometimes reused Kushite sites. They inherited in altered form its people. In other words, Kush didn't leave a vacuum. It left a crowded room. And through all of this, there's continuity beneath the upheaval. Potters along the Nile kept shaping clay in ways that would look familiar to a Kushite artisan, even as they added crosses or new decorative bands. Metalworkers kept smelting iron and working gold. Some motifs, lions, certain geometric patterns, particular ways of rendering human faces, persist in local crafts well into the Christian period. Institutions shifted more slowly than royal names. You can trace echoes of older temple estates and sacred landscapes in the way later churches and monasteries are sited. You can see social hierarchies that feel like reconfigured versions of earlier orders. Local nobles, warrior elites, clergy claiming moral authority, villagers navigating between them. The languages spoken along the river evolved, absorbed new elements, but they didn't reset to zero when the last Meroitic scribe put down his pen. Even religion, which seems to turn sharply when Christianity arrives, likely carried forward subterranean continuities. Holy hills, springs, and stretches of river that had once been associated with Kushite gods didn't stop being special because someone built a church there. They were given new stories, new saints, new liturgies overlaying much older sacred geography. So when we talk about the decline of Kush, we're really talking about long transition. Environmental stress, economic sidelining, pressure from rising neighbours like Aksum, internal fragmentation, and gradual transformation into a patchwork of successor states. The empire as a centralised, pyramid-building, Meroitic writing state dissolved. The civilization, in the sense of people, skills, memories and landscapes, flowed on into new shapes. Yet, somewhere along that journey, something else happened. The world not only watched an empire change, it forgot that empire had ever really been there. Later writers folded its memory into vague Ethiopias, misnamed its ruins, or ignored them altogether. Modern scholars, reading mainly Greek and Latin, looked right past it. Decline is one thing. Political systems are born and die all the time. Erasure from history, that takes a different kind of power. And that's the next part of the story. Erasure starts with something simple. People stop speaking your language. Not all at once. There's no day when a herald rides through Meroe and says, "From now on, please switch to Greek, or Coptic, or Old Nubian, thank you." It happens at the edges first. Traders who once did business in Meroitic, or in earlier Nubian dialects, realize that if they want better deals in Egyptian ports, they need to haggle in Greek. Priests who once recited hymns in the words of Amun of Napatan now add Christian prayers in Coptic or Greek or later Old Nubian. Parents who want their children to succeed push them toward the languages of power, and the script, the visual skin of that language, goes with it. Somewhere in the last centuries of Kush, a scribe sat down to write in Meroitic for the last time. Maybe he was recording an offering, maybe a legal agreement, maybe a prayer. Then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, nobody trained a replacement. We know this because Meroitic writing just stops. Inscriptions get rarer, then vanish. The last dated use is around the 4th century CE. After that, stones are carved in other scripts, other tongues. Meroitic becomes a language without scribes, then a language without readers, then a language that exists only as a ghost in place names and loanwords. To everyone living through it, this is just generational shift. To historians 1,500 years later, it's a catastrophe. Because now we have text, but no voice. We see lines of Meroitic carved on temple walls, stelae, funerary chapels. We've figured out what the letters sound like thanks to the work of scholars comparing them to Egyptian and using bilingual inscriptions. But we don't know the vocabulary well enough to actually read it fluently. Imagine having hundreds of pages of Roman history in Latin, but nobody on earth can understand Latin. Dates, king lists, local laws, religious hymns, diplomatic correspondence, all there, but locked behind a code you can only partly crack. That's what the loss of a language does. It doesn't just cut the past off from the future, it gives later storytellers room to fill the silence with whatever they want, and those storytellers were not Kushites. For most of the last 2,000 years, the people who wrote the texts that defined world history weren't living in Nubia. They were in Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, Rome, later in Paris, London, Berlin. They wrote in Greek, Latin, and then in European languages. They pulled their raw material from the libraries and anthologies they had, which overwhelmingly preserved Greco-Roman perspectives. So when your main narrative sources about Northeast Africa are Herodotus, Strabo, Pliny, and later Byzantine chronicles, the camera is pointed in a very particular direction. From their vantage point, Kush is never the main character. At best, it's a supporting role in Egypt's story, or a backdrop in Rome's. A place that sends gold, elephants and warriors. A land of Ethiopians on the far side of the cataracts. Impressive, exotic, but not an empire with its own long history and internal logic. Layer on top of that a problem of labels. Ancient Greek and Roman writers loved big, vague geographic buckets. Ethiopia could mean almost anything south of Egypt. Nubia, the Sudanese Nile, parts of the Horn of Africa, even Yemen in some texts. Nubia itself is a term that hardens later and gets applied backward across centuries of different states and cultures. Kush, or Kush, appears in biblical and other Near Eastern sources, but what territory it points to shifts over time. Then you have Egyptian, a word that to many early modern scholars swallowed everything along the Nile. If you're a European classicist in the 18th or 19th century, reading Latin and Greek and looking at ruins, it's easy, dangerously easy, to lump distinct African polities into a blur. Temples south of Aswan must be Egyptian influence. Pyramids somewhere beyond. Probably degenerate Egyptian copies. Inscriptions you can't read. Conveniently, they don't get to speak for themselves. Mislabeling becomes its own kind of erasure. When a Kushite king rules Egypt and sits on the throne at Thebes, Greek writers call him Ethiopian, or just another Egyptian king. When Meroe is described, it's often as a distant city of Ethiopians with queens, not as the capital of a long-standing state. Later, when scholars go hunting in text for great civilizations, they search for familiar names: Egypt, Rome, Greece, and anything that doesn't fit those categories slides into the margins as regional background. By the time modern European historians built school curricula, the hierarchy was locked in. Greece is the cradle of philosophy, Rome is the model of empire and law, Egypt is the exotic ancient neighbour whose monuments wow classical tourists. Nubia and Kush? Maybe a sentence or a footnote, usually framed as southern neighbours of Egypt, or tribal kingdoms on the frontier. All of this might have been corrected earlier if Kushi archives had survived, but papyrus rots, leather cracks, clay tablets survive best in dry-sealed conditions, and Kush didn't build its chancelleries in the same way Mesopotamian cities did. Whatever state archives existed in palaces or temple storehouses were vulnerable to fire, damp, reuse, and sheer time. We have inscriptions carved in stone because stone lasts. We have graffiti on temple walls. We have a scattering of documents on pottery sherds and other media. But the equivalent of a royal library at Meroe, if it ever existed in a centralized way, is gone. And that absence creates a power vacuum. When your own records vanish, other people's records become the default truth. Egyptian king lists remember the 25th dynasty as a Kushite episode in their story. Roman authors mention Ethiopian wars in passing. Medieval Coptic and Arabic chronicles fold older memories into religious frameworks. Everybody is talking about you, but almost no one is preserving what you said about yourself. Then the physical landscape joins in the forgetting. Ruins don't sit untouched waiting for modern archaeologists. They get quarried, reused, flooded, looted. For centuries, villagers along the Nile reused ancient blocks as building material. Pyramids and temples in Nubia, like their cousins in Egypt, were convenient sources of dressed stone. Tombs were robbed in antiquity, and again in the early modern period, treasures melted down or scattered into private collections with no records of origin. In the 20th century, massive dam projects on the Nile, at Aswan and elsewhere, created reservoirs that drowned whole stretches of ancient landscape. International salvage campaigns rushed to document and move monuments, but priorities were uneven. Egyptian temples and pharaonic sites received enormous attention. Nubian and Kushite sites did get rescue work, but many smaller cemeteries, settlements, and unexcavated mounds disappeared underwater forever. Even where sites were dug, early excavation practices did damage. 19th and early 20th century archaeologists often arrived with a treasure hunter mindset. They focused on big, impressive objects, statues, gold, painted walls, stratigraphy, small finds, organic remains, things that tell you about everyday life and slow change, received less care, if any. In Nubia, foreign missions sometimes cut massive trenches through cemeteries, cleared pyramids quickly, and shipped key finds to museums in Europe without detailed context. Pottery was tossed aside, burial goods separated from their positions, inscriptions removed from the surfaces that framed them. Nobody was deliberately trying to erase Kush. They were just working within a system that valued trophies over understanding. But the effect is similar. Layers of meaning scraped away. Then colonial ideology adds one more, corrosive layer. As European empires took control of Sudan and Egypt, they brought with them a set of assumptions about Africa. That advanced civilization was something that came from outside, that complex states south of the Mediterranean must be derivative, copies, offshoots, or accidents caused by contact with supposedly more civilized peoples. So when scholars in the late 19th and early 20th centuries looked at Kush, many framed it as an extension of Egypt, or as a brief flare caused by Egyptian influence that never quite became civilization in its own right. Ironworking, surely imported, monumental architecture, Egyptian imitation, writing, a peripheral script, interesting but secondary. This narrative was convenient. It kept the mental map simple. Civilization radiates out from a handful of centres, Greece, Rome, Egypt, later Europe, and everywhere else reflects or receives. It also fit neatly with racist hierarchies that insisted sub-Saharan Africa had no real history before contact. Strip away language, mislabel the ruins, let your own archives rot, allow external observers with their own biases to define you, and then let colonial ideology file you under derivative. That's how a civilization gets erased. Not because it wasn't there, because layer by layer, its ability to speak for itself was smothered. But erasure is never perfect. In the last few decades, you can see the script flipping. Sudanese archaeologists and historians are leading more and more of the work on Nubian sites, framing research questions from within the region's own history, rather than as footnotes to Egypt. Universities in Sudan and across Africa are training specialists in Meroitic studies, Nubian languages and regional archaeology. International teams are going back to old collections in European and North American museums, recataloguing objects taken from Nubia and Kush. Pottery, once labelled vaguely as Egyptian unknown provenance, is being re-identified as Meroitic or Napatan. Statues of kings and queens that sat in basements for a century are being recognised as Kushite, not Egyptian. Museums are rethinking how they tell the story. Instead of putting a Kushite object in an Egyptian room as a curiosity, curators are building Nubia-focused exhibits that present Kush as a state with its own timeline, its own internal developments, its own artistic and religious experiments. Labels now say King of Kush, rather than Ethiopian ruler. Maps show Napata and Meroe as capitals, not distant outposts. On the academic side, Nubian-centered scholarship is rewriting the frameworks. Rather than treating Kush as a passive recipient, researchers are emphasizing how it chose what to adopt and what to transform, how it projected power southward and eastward, how it interacted with desert and savanna peoples on its own terms. And the biggest frontier is still the language. Work on Meroitic continues. Linguists are comparing it with modern Nubian languages, Nilo-Saharan families, and neighbouring tongues, trying to build a better dictionary, to move from "we can pronounce this" to "we can understand this." Each new inscription, each re-examination of old texts, has the potential to unlock names, titles, even historical events that have been mute for 1,600 years. We're still missing huge pieces. We don't yet have a full Kushite royal chronicle, detailed economic records, or a clear sense of how everyone from farmers to priests experienced the empire. Large parts of the southern and western reaches of Kush remain underexplored. Under reservoirs, beneath modern villages, in unexcavated mounds, there are likely archives of pottery, bones, and maybe even texts waiting. But the direction of travel has changed. For most of modern historiography, Kush was a shadow on the edge of Egypt's light. Now, the spotlight is slowly swinging south. Each excavation, each reinterpreted object, each line of half-decoded script is another piece of a story that never truly vanished. It was just buried under other people's versions. The next step is to follow those clues forward. If this much can be recovered after centuries of neglect and literal submersion, what happens when we start asking different questions? When we stop assuming and start listening to what the ground, the texts, and the living descendants along the Nile are actually saying? That's where we turn next, to the evidence we have today, and to the mysteries that still make Kush one of the most intriguing and stubbornly resilient empires in human history. So, standing in the early 21st century, what can we actually say with confidence about this empire that was supposed to be a footnote and keeps refusing to stay small? Start with what's nailed down by multiple independent lines of evidence. We know Kush was not a local kingdom hugging the riverbank. The sheer spread of its monuments tells us that. Napatan temples and cemeteries stretch over hundreds of kilometres of Nile Valley. Meroitic sites push farther south and east, toward the Butana Plain and the Ethiopian highlands. Fortified outposts and way stations dot desert routes that lead into Chad, Darfur and the Red Sea Hills. That's not the footprint of a village chiefdom, that's infrastructure. We know Kush wielded serious military power. Egyptian reliefs don't just gripe about southern raiders, they show organised armies, chariots, archers, standards. Assyrian and later Greco-Roman sources talk about Ethiopian forces fighting as far away as the Levant and the Red Sea coasts. Kushite weapons, armour and imported war gear show up in graves from the royal cemeteries down to lesser burials. This isn't myth, it's steel, bronze and bone. We know Kush controlled and redirected wealth on a massive scale. The density of royal pyramids at Napata and Meroe, hundreds of them, requires a tax base that could feed builders, quarry stone, move materials, and sustain an elite cult for generations. Grave goods include imported glass, wine amphorae from the Mediterranean, Indian Ocean shells, Arabian incense, African hardwoods, ivory and gold. These are not random trinkets. They are the residue of trade systems that stitched Kush into a world economy, stretching from Spain to India. We know they weren't just copying Egypt. Yes, there are familiar gods and temple layouts, but the art, royal titulature, burial practices and city plans diverge in consistent ways. Meroe's urban layout, its industrial iron zones, its unique blend of iconography on royal statues, these all point to an internal logic, a political and religious system developed over centuries on its own terms. And we know Kush lasted. If you draw a line from the rise of Kerma as a serious kingdom to the end of Meroe as a royal capital, you're looking at something on the order of 1,500 to 2,000 years of organised statehood in the same broad region. That's Rome length. Longer than many Chinese dynasties, longer than most of the polities that fill Western textbooks. That's the baseline. A long-lived, militarily capable, economically plugged-in African empire with its own royal line, cults and cities. Not a frontier camp, not a side quest. But the closer you look, the more you realise how much of that picture is still sketched in with pencil instead of ink. And a lot of the sharpest tools for filling it in are only now coming online. Take the language problem you just heard about. For a long time, Meroitic studies were stuck in a kind of holding pattern. We knew the sounds of the script. We had some names, a few titles, and lots of unknown word, maybe a date. That's slowly changing. Linguists are using huge digital corpora of Meroitic inscriptions, comparing spelling patterns across hundreds of texts, looking for consistent structures and borrowed words. Some are testing statistical models developed for code breaking and machine translation. Others are drilling down into modern Nubian languages, scanning for echoes, roots that might have survived the fall of the script and drifted through the centuries in oral speech. Every small breakthrough matters. Deciphering one administrative term can turn a line of text from X of the king into overseer of granaries of the king. Suddenly you know this was a taxation system, not a generic honorific. Recognizing a recurring phrase as in year X of King Y lets you build real chronological anchors instead of guessing from art style. It's painstaking, incremental work. Nobody expects a Rosetta Stone miracle, but each tiny step chips away at 1,600 years of silence and moves Meroa from mysterious toward knowable. At the same time, archaeology has quietly gone high-tech. From space, literally, Kush is becoming easier to see. Satellite archaeology and remote sensing let researchers scan wide stretches of desert and floodplain for buried walls, tumuli, and ancient river courses. Subtle differences in soil moisture, vegetation, or surface colour can reveal the outlines of forgotten towns, fortlets, and cemeteries. In the last 2 decades, dozens of new sites associated with Kushite phases have been identified this way, far beyond the handful of famous royal centres. On the ground, tools like ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry can map what's beneath the surface before a single trench is dug. That matters enormously in Nubia, where time, funding and political conditions limit how much you can excavate. You don't have to guess where the palace or workshop district might be. You can see it in the data and choose carefully. Then there's what happens once you start finding bones and pots, not just temples and statues. Isotope analysis, looking at the chemical signatures locked in tooth enamel and bone, lets researchers track where people grew up, what they ate, and how that changed during their lives. In Kushite cemeteries, this can distinguish locals from migrants, high-status diets from everyday ones, farmers from pastoralists. You can suddenly test questions that used to be vague hand-waving. Were Kushite armies filled with conscripted locals, or did the kings rely on mobile desert groups? Did the elites at Meroa live off Nile grain and imported wine while villagers ate sorghum and millet? How far were people moving along the empire's north-south axis in a single lifetime? Refined dating techniques add another layer. Radiocarbon dating keeps getting more precise. Thermoluminescence and other methods help date ceramics and fired bricks. Combined with tree ring sequences and global climate proxies, scholars can line up building phases at Kushite temples with known droughts, Nile floods, or trade disruptions. Instead of saying, somewhere in the late Meroitic period, you can say, this fort was built within a few decades of that Roman campaign, or this shift in burial practice lines up with a regional arid phase. Cause and effect remain tricky, but the timelines get tighter. All of this data doesn't just fill in trivia, it sharpens the big questions. Population size, for example. How many people actually lived within Kush at its peak? Were we talking 500,000? 2 million? More? The answer changes how we understand everything from agricultural surplus to military capacity. Right now, estimates are rough, but as more settlement sites are mapped, as more rural cemeteries are counted, as more environmental reconstructions show how much land was cultivable in different centuries, those numbers will get less fuzzy. Kush may turn out to have been more densely populated than once assumed, or we may find a thinner core tied to large belts of semi-nomadic allies on its fringes. Provincial governance is another open frontier. We know kings and kandakes ruled from Napatan and Meroa. We can see some titles carved on stele: governors, priests, local elites. But how exactly did control flow outward? were distant regions managed through hereditary local dynasties bound by marriage and oath. Rotating officials sent from the capital. Religious networks anchored on shared cults of Amun and local gods. Here, archaeology and Meroitic go hand in hand. If satellite surveys keep turning up standardized administrative compounds or temples with identical state cult iconography, hundreds of kilometers apart, that points to strong centralization. If isotope studies show provincial burials filled with people born far away, we might be looking at a mobile ruling class. If language work reveals different legal formulae in different regions, that suggests negotiated autonomy. Then there's the depth of trade networks. We know Kush touched the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. We know Indian Ocean goods reached its cities. The question now is, how far did Kushite merchants and agents go themselves, and how much did they rely on intermediaries? Residue analysis on pottery can identify what liquids once filled those jars: wine, oil, fish sauce, perfume. Lead isotope analysis on metal objects can trace where the ore came from: mines in the Eastern Desert, the Arabian Peninsula, maybe even Europe. Genetic analysis of plant remains, seeds, charcoal, can show when crops like sorghum, barley or cotton moved in and out of the region. Piece this together, and you move beyond Kush was on trade routes to Kush-controlled, taxed, and sometimes monopolized specific arteries of global exchange, which is a very different picture of power. As these specialist tools do their work, something quieter but equally important is happening in the public sphere. Textbooks are starting to change. Where older surveys of ancient history jumped from Egypt straight to Greece, newer ones are inserting chapters on Nubia and Kush as independent actors. Instead of one paragraph on the Nubian 25th dynasty, there's a broader arc. Kerma, Napatan, Meroitic, and their roles in shaping the Nile world. Museums are rewriting labels, redesigning galleries. Kushite objects are grouped together as the material of a named state, with its own map and timeline rather than scattered through Egyptian cases. Audio guides mention kings like Piye, Taharqa, and queens like Amanarenas as protagonists, not exotic side notes. Documentaries and online channels are picking up the story, not just as Lost Black Pharaohs clickbait, but as sustained narratives about how African polities built cities, fought wars with Rome, ran iron industries, managed environmental change. Most crucially, local heritage work in Sudan and neighbouring countries is foregrounding Kush as part of living identity. Community-based projects involve villagers in documenting and protecting nearby sites. School programs frame pyramids at places like Nuri and Meroe not as foreign curiosities, but as the work of their own ancestors. Sudanese filmmakers, writers, and artists are weaving Kush into novels, comics, and films, reclaiming what colonial narratives tried to flatten. All of this pushes against the old habit of placing Africa's ancient past in the margins, because once you start seeing Kush clearly, the entire mental map of world history shifts a little. You stop thinking of civilization as a one-way flow from north to south, from centre to periphery. Instead, you see a network of interacting powers, a Nile empire in Nubia trading ideas and goods with Egypt, the Levant, Arabia and the Savannas, a kingdom that helped shape the religious landscape of the region, a state that Rome had to negotiate with, not simply conquer. Africa isn't an empty space waiting for history to arrive. It's one of the places where history was being made, where metallurgy, kingship, monumental architecture, long-distance trade, and written language were all being experimented with in ways that mattered far beyond the Nile. And the story is still not finished. There are unexcavated mounds that might turn out to be provincial capitals. There are inscriptions sitting in museum storerooms that, once re-examined, could shift whole chronologies. There are genetic and environmental studies that might reveal how Kush weathered droughts that toppled other states. Some answers will come from satellites and lab benches. Others will come from conversations in Nubian villages, from oral histories that remember old places and old kings in ways written archives never captured. So here's where you come back in. At the start of this video, you dropped your location in the comments. A dot on the map, a city, a region, a country you call home. Now that you've walked, at least in imagination, through Kerma's mud brick halls, Napata's cliffs, Meroa's iron-smoked streets, look at that dot again. How far is it from Kush? How many of the ideas, technologies, and stories that shaped your world passed through African empires like this one on their way to you? How different would our shared picture of the past look if Kush had never been pushed to the margins? Tell me again where you're watching from, and tell me now that you've met this empire what part of its story you most want to see uncovered next. So when we say erased, what are we actually talking about? Not that Kush vanished. The pyramids at Nuri and Meroe never teleported away. The temples at Jebel Barkal didn't dissolve into dust. People kept living along that stretch of the Nile. They remembered shrines, told stories, reused stones, farmed fields watered by canals, first dug when Kushite kings were arguing with pharaohs. The erasure happened somewhere else. It happened in the stories later powers chose to tell about themselves. In how Egyptian scribes framed Nubia as a place of gold and captives. In how Greek and Roman authors lumped everyone south of Egypt into a vague Ethiopia, a hazy land of marvels at the edge of the map. In how early European scholars, reading those texts and seeing those skin tones, decided that what lay beyond Egypt couldn't possibly be a peer civilization. It happened every time a timeline leapt from Old Kingdom pyramids to classical Athens, like the stretch of Nile between Aswan and Khartoum was just blank water. But there's a limit to how far you can push a story that isn't true. Kush refused to stay forgotten for the same reason those 1,280 bottleneck survivors refused to die out in that other story, because reality kept pushing back. A French soldier in the 1820s notices pyramids in Sudan that aren't quite like the ones at Giza. 19th century explorers bring back sketches of ruined temples that don't fit the neat Egypt then nothing narrative. 20th century archaeologists dig at Kerma and realize they are not looking at an Egyptian fort, but at an independent capital that predated some of Egypt's own greatest moments. Piece by piece, the silence tore. Kerma, the first great Nubian kingdom, comes into focus. Massive mud brick halls, royal tombs, a court that could treat with Egypt on nearly equal terms, and, at times, beat it back. Napata rises on the stage, the city where Kush turned the tables, sent armies north, and wore the double crown as pharaohs of a united Nile. Meroe follows. Iron furnaces, scribes carving a script no one else could read, merchants running caravans that stitched together Central Africa, the Red Sea and the Mediterranean world. Same region, same broad cultural continuum, but not the same story on repeat. What ties them together is not a single unbroken dynasty, but a long arc of resilience. A kingdom at Kerma learns how to harness the river and the desert, how to organize labor, how to project power upstream and down. Centuries later, after Egyptian conquest and cultural pressure, a revitalized Kushite elite at Napata takes those tools, refurbishes them, and uses them to rule Egypt itself. When changing trade routes and politics make the old heartland less viable, the center of gravity shifts again, downriver to Meroe, where iron smelting, new gods, new titles, and a new script grow from older roots. At every step, Kush is absorbing shocks that would have shattered smaller polities. Foreign invasion, climatic swings, shifting trade hubs, internal change. Instead of disappearing, it morphs, it experiments, it keeps a thread of kingship, cult, and language running through nearly 2,000 years. That's what makes the comparison to Rome meaningful, not in the sense of identical institutions, but in the sense of scale, duration, and geopolitical weight. You had an African empire that at various points could dictate terms to Egypt, could sit across the table from Ptolemaic rulers and Roman prefects and say no, and back that refusal with fortresses and archers. an empire that sent embassies and probably gifts to the same Mediterranean world that was writing the sources we still rely on. Kush wasn't a rumour at the edge of someone else's map. It was a named player in the game. It negotiated with Rome, traded with Rome, and when negotiations failed, it fought Rome and survived. So when we talk about Kush being erased, hold both truths at once. On the ground, the empire left so much behind that modern tools can reconstruct its skeleton. City grids, necropolises, trade arteries, royal genealogies stretching from Kerma's tumuli to Meroa's crowded pyramid fields. In the record, though, a lot of that was flattened. Reduced to a line about Ethiopians in a Roman war report. Squeezed into a footnote under an Egyptian king list. Filtered through colonial assumptions that couldn't imagine black African states as anything but peripheral. The work happening now, those satellite surveys, isotope studies, linguistic analyses, is not just about adding new facts. It's about reversing that flattening, giving names back to unnamed rulers, restoring agency to regions that were written as scenery, and you're part of that process. Every time you watch, read, or talk about Kush as an empire with its own timeline, you're helping shift the baseline of what ancient history even means. You're making it a little harder for the next textbook or documentary to pretend that nothing important happened between Aswan and the Sixth Cataract. So, now that you've walked the arc from Kerma to Napatan to Meroe, I want to hear from you. What in this story surprised you the most? Was it the idea that Kushite kings once ruled as pharaohs of Egypt? The fact that Meroe was running a full-blown iron industry while Rome was still figuring out its frontiers? The thought of Candaces negotiating and clashing with Roman governors on essentially equal diplomatic footing? And where are you listening from? Drop your city or region in the comments again. I love seeing all the dots on the map when we're talking about a past that belongs to all of us. If you'd like to go even further back, beyond Kush, beyond Egypt, into the deep prehistory of our species and the kind of survival story you heard in that bottleneck excerpt, there's a book I wrote about those prehistoric secrets. You can read more about it or pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. It dives into how a few thousand fragile humans almost didn't make it, and how that crisis shaped everything that came after. And if this journey through a not-so-forgotten empire was worth your time, it genuinely helps when you like the video, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Tell me what you want to explore next. More on Nubian queens, the Aksumite kingdom across the Red Sea, trans-Saharan trade before Islam? Kush refused to stay erased because the evidence was always there, waiting for someone to pay attention. Now that you've seen it, the question is, what other missing empires are still hiding in plain sight just outside the borders of the stories we were taught? We'll find them, one forgotten chapter at a time.